1014 The growing group, all right, Emlyn replied very calmly. Marie didn't speak further as his figure vanished. He knew that it was impossible to come up with a specific plan in an instant. Emlyn White had to first seek the opinion of the upper echelons of the Sanguine, therefore he didn't stay. This might be a chance for me to obtain godhood and become an earl. Emlyn smiled as he watched the wraith, Marie, leave silently. He had yet to digest the Scarlet Scholar Beyonder characteristic. The so-called opportunity to become an earl referred to the promise of obtaining a free ritual and the corresponding potion formula. The carriage continued forward and stopped at the entrance of the Harvest Church. Emlyn looked at the grayish-white fog in the sky with a look of satisfaction, pressed down on his silk top hat, and unhurriedly alighted the carriage before entering the cathedral's door. After changing into his brown priest robe, he picked up a cloth and a pail of water and began seriously wiping the surface of the candle stands. After Father Yutravsky, who appeared taller, finished his morning sermon, Emlyn stopped working and grumbled, "Why was Ernst allowed to return? He only requested to do a month of volunteer work." Father Yutravsky wasn't annoyed by Emlyn's repeated question from time to time, appearing extremely patient. Upon thinking of his encounter, Emlyn immediately felt indignant. He couldn't help but mumble. He was forced to do volunteer work, not out of his own accord. He can't be allowed to decide on the period. He needs to serve at least half a year. Father Yutravsky replied with a smile. He did well. He worked hard the entire month, guiding the devotees and copying the Bible. I could clearly sense that he had already realized the value of life and the joy of the harvest. Emlyn's facial muscles twitched slightly. Is he soon going to become a believer of Earth Mother? No, I didn't force him to change his faith, Father Yutravsky said gently. I only taught him the teachings of Earth Mother and to sense the traces and fragments that life brings. I hope that he will recall the home for the soul, the mother's embrace, whenever he feels lost. Emlyn's lips quivered, but he ultimately didn't say a word. He lowered his head and continued wiping. In an apartment in Sherwood Borough, Furs sat on a high-back chair, her gaze focused on an empty glass bottle on the desk in front of her. She had finally digested the astrologer potion some time ago. Today, under Zio's watch, she had concocted the Asmon's brain and the ancient wraith's cursed item into the scribe potion. She mustered her courage and drank it. At this moment, she felt her brain rapidly expanding. The grand folds and white matter rapidly increased as her body gradually blurred, separating into individual cells. Those cells formed a haloed door that circled her brain. Furs subtly heard the familiar ravings, but they were indistinct and blurry, preventing her from identifying the exact words at all. To the experienced her, it didn't affect her in any way. After an unknown period of time, Furs finally regained control over her brain and cells and could sense her body's existence. Almost at the same time, a large amount of knowledge resonated in her mind, making her understand how to use the powers of a scribe. The mutated brain reproduced the Beyonder powers used by the target before driving a portion of the vitalized cells to form corresponding symbols, patterns, and labels for complete storage. This was I came, I saw, I record, which used one's soul as a pen and one's spirit body as the paper. At present, I can only record one Beyonder power that has the influence of godhood. The higher the target sequence, the higher the chances of my failure. Even targeted at sequence 4, one might not be able to succeed even once in 10 attempts. I can record 8 sequence 5 and 6 Beyonder powers, and the effects are half of the original. I can record 20 sequence 7 to sequence 9 Beyonder powers with their effects being almost like the original. When the potion is digested further, I'll enjoy an enhancement in all these aspects. Furs concluded the knowledge and her experiences before silently muttering to herself. This appeared to overlap with Lamino's travels, but Furs felt that no one would ever find having too many Beyonder powers being excessive. Besides, the two were complementary. After all, she could rent Lamino's travels to other Tarot Club members and be paid with Beyonder powers. However, she was unable to rent herself out. At sequence 6, an apprentice finally has sufficient combat strength. Furs reigned in her thoughts as she sighed to Zio. She then took a pen and paper and began writing a letter. Dear teacher, I'm very pleased to inform you that I've finally become a scribe. I'm just one step away from my dreams of traveling. After writing a few sentences, she saw Zio stand up and walk towards the door from the corner of her eye. She hurriedly shouted at her, Hey, shouldn't we head to a restaurant to celebrate? Zio replied in a stern manner, Your overflowing spirituality is rather serious. You'll need several days of cogitation to keep it under control. You aren't allowed to smoke or drink. Don't overly indulge yourself in your emotions. After the advice, she added, I still have commissions to do. I almost have enough to exchange for the judge formula. All right. Furs threw up her hands. After leaving the house, Zio unlocked the chains and got onto a bicycle specially created for use. She then rode towards Hillstonborough. According to the intelligence she had previously obtained, Viscount Stratford had reserved lunch at a luxurious restaurant. Upon reaching the restaurant, Zio secured the bike to a street lamp and found a secluded corner to observe the people passing by. After an unknown period of time, a carriage drove through the thin fog. There was a coat of arms with a flower and 2 rings engraved on it. Zio's focus intensified as she watched the carriage stop at the restaurant's entrance. She then saw the grizzled Viscount Stratford, who was in his 40s, get off first. He then extended his hand to the passenger behind him like a gentleman. It was a lady draped in a dark red cloak. Zio couldn't see the lady's face and only noticed that the lady's jaw was soft and her skin fair. On the Blue Avenger at the northern Sonia Sea, Alger Wilson's feet left the ground as he floated behind the window of the captain's cabin. He stared at the deck and distant waves outside. Having already digested a portion of the Ocean Songster potion, he had reported to the Church of Storms 2 weeks ago and had accumulated enough contribution points to obtain a wind-blessed potion and successfully consumed it. This also meant that he was officially a Sequence 6. Of course, he had to redigest the wind-blessed potion, but that wasn't too difficult. The biggest problem is that the commotion created from digesting the Ocean Songster is too obvious. I should have bought that Word of the Sea and blamed the singing on it every time. Alger sighed silently, but he didn't feel too much regret. This was because even if he wanted to buy it back then, he didn't have the money for it. Furthermore, he had figured out the way to digest the Ocean Songster potion. I should be able to get the information soon and confirm who that Faceac Navy officer that Mr. Fool wishes to investigate is. Alger retracted his gaze and floated back to the desk where there was a brass sextant. At this moment, 2 sailors passed by the deck while belching. There seemed to be sirens in these waters. I always hear their singing at night, one of the sailors said in uncertainty. His companion sneered. How is that possible? How can a siren sound so bad? It must be some noise produced by some sea monster. City of Silver, in the training field which wasn't as crowded compared to during daytime. A pile of blue ice was stacked there like a small mountain. Derek didn't bring his weapon with him as he stood empty-handed in front of the mountain of ice, piously praying, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. After chanting the honorific name and making his request, he looked at the chief of the 6-member council, Colin Iliad, walk towards the ice blocks from afar. Colin, with 2 swords on his back, carried a bottle of light-emitting and hot golden liquid. He watched as Derek exerted his strength to enter the ice block and bury himself inside completely without leaving a single crack. A deep and hazy darkness descended. Even with the lightning streaking across the sky, it was unable to illuminate the interior. In the blink of an eye, an indescribable surge appeared as though pairs of eyes were cast over from the depths of the darkness. Colin Iliad could clearly sense that Derek was in a deep slumber. Even though Derek was being frozen in ice that normally didn't melt and his body was trembling, he didn't wake up. Without any hesitation, he threw the potion bottle ahead of him. A wraith-like transparent figure floated above and enveloped it. This figure passed through the blue ice and came to the cramped space where Derek was. It took out the potion and placed it by Derek's mouth. Just as this action was done, it immediately retreated and left the ice blocks. Colin Iliad suddenly drew his sword and cleaved behind him to his right. A monster, whose rotting body was covered in eyes, burst out into yellow pus. It wasn't known where it came from. At this moment, Colin saw a radiant light emerge from the pile of blue ice. They scattered pure light, with a burning intensity, warmth, brightness, and vitality that was different from the surrounding lightning. This filled Colin's eyes as if the light had come from the Dark Ages. This city of Silver Chief watched intently and was motionless for a long time until another monster emerged from the darkness. In the ancient palace above the fog. Little Sun is at sequence 5-2. Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he cast his eyes at the crimson star representing the sun and cast it to another star. That signified Miss Justice. Over the past month or so, she had completed many of the Psychology Alchemist's missions and had exchanged her contribution for the Dreamwalker's potion formula. This also meant that she was about to meet Vin Rambis again. 1015 March of War Backland, at the residence of the furniture merchant, Hempress. Audrey once again met the counselor of the Psychology Alchemists, Vin Rambis. This old gentleman remained warm and elegant. His white but lush hair was neatly combed. His blue, deep eyes seemed to contain infinite knowledge. Upon seeing him, Audrey's eyes wore a vacant look before she came to a realization. It was as though she had finally awoken from a long dream and recovered her lost memories. She wasn't surprised or puzzled by this at all, accepting this fact without any resistance as if it was something very normal. "Good afternoon, Mr. Rambis," Audrey greeted with the etiquette that was flawless. Rambis nodded slightly and replied with a smile, "Good afternoon, our girl." Over the past month or so, he had gradually adopted the idea that she was the pride of the Psychology Alchemists and the most important girl. Audrey glanced at the diamond brooch at her chest and sat down with a smile, waiting for Vin Rambis to speak. In regard to the cue and guidance, she hadn't been affected at all due to her preparations. At that moment, when she heard Vin Rambis call her that, she wished to ignore everything, etiquette or whatnot, rolling her eyes without being afraid of being exposed. However, she ultimately held back without exposing any problems. Vin Rambis looked at Audrey for a few seconds before saying with the same smile, "You've done well during this period of time. As a reward, we've decided to give you the potion formula for Dreamwalk." As he spoke, he took out a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket and placed it on the coffee table. He then pushed it towards the noble lady. Audrey pressed down on her skirt and got up slightly. She picked up the piece of paper and unfolded it in front of Vin Rambis. Her gaze first fell on the main ingredients before she quickly skimmed the ritual. Main ingredients: 1 Dreamcatcher's heart, 1 Mind Illusion crystal or a mature mind dragon's complete brain. Ritual: seek out a harpy in the spirit world and sign a contract with it. Then, holding 1 tail feather, consume the potion amidst intense feelings of either joy or anger. As though sensing Audrey's puzzlement, Vin Rambis explained with a smile, "A harpy has the ability to give nightmares. It can snap people awake from their dreams, so the entire ritual's essence is to be immersed in a dream and be unwilling to wake up from it. Get pulled out of the dream via an external force, or else you might sleep forever or lose control and turn into a monster." Audrey nodded in thought. "The requirement to consume the potion amidst intense feelings is to prevent myself from sleeping too soundly and deeply?" "Yes, you've already grasped the crux of the matter," Vin Rambis said with a smile. "If you don't know much about the spirit world and can't find a harpy, we can provide some help. If the ritual's essence is for me to wake up from a dream, that means that the harpy isn't necessary. The blessings of Mr. Fool's angel can allow me to remain lucid in dreams. I can wake up whenever I want." Audrey's green eyes darted about and said with looks of anticipation, "I can try it myself first." "All right." Vin didn't mind the girl's desire to take risks. He paused and said, "I have another matter for you. If you do it well, we will provide you with all the ingredients of the Dreamwalker potion." "What is it?" Audrey asked without any resistance, just like before. Vin Rambis said with a slightly solemn expression, "Find out the attitudes of your father, Earl Hall, the present Duke Negan, Admiral Emirius, and the other nobles about a relatively major war." "War?" Audrey repeated the word that she had often heard but found somewhat unfamiliar. She had a vague feeling that ripples had suddenly formed under the surface of a seemingly calm lake. Above the gray fog, Klein listened to Miss Justice's prayer and fell into deep thought. He was unable to determine whether the psychology alchemists, Hermes, or maybe even Adam, who was lurking behind them, welcomed or objected to a war. As for whether the lone king, the prime minister, and a number of nobles and the members of parliaments wanted war, the answer was relatively clear. Last year, the hanged man had once asked Miss Justice a similar question. Her answer was that the king and prime minister had the tendencies of being warmongers, but they had chosen to first focus on internal reforms and settle the connections over various matters. Now, about a year had passed, and all the policies that had been implemented were on track. In other words, it was time to start a war to snatch back the interests which Lone had lost in East Balam. It's a revolutionary era. The strife between countries are intense, and once war begins, it's unlikely that it can be controlled. Furthermore, Adam, Ammon, and the other kings of angels have appeared one after another, have already retrieved key items, or are seeking breakthroughs. A storm is about to descend on the mysterious world, and danger is lurking. Klein sighed and returned to the real world. The next day, he first went to St. Samuel Cathedral to pray according to his schedule and donated tens of pounds. Following that, he went to 22 Phelps Street, planning to participate in some of the business of the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. The moment he stepped inside, Klein saw Miss Audrey Hall and a few of the foundation's staff coming down the stairs and walking towards the door. This noble lady was dressed very simply today. Her hair was tied up into a simple bun, and she wore no other accessories. Her dress was light green in color, and her sleeves had a circle of frills. There were no laces or tassels. "Good morning, Miss Audrey." Klein took off his hat as usual and bowed. He then nodded at the staff and greeted them. After Audrey responded, Klein casually asked, "Where are you going?" He knew that Miss Justice's main role in the foundation was to seek donations from the various ladies and gentlemen in high society. Audrey replied with a faint smile, "Visit the various universities and show some concern to the students we helped previously." Having said that, she blinked her eyes as her smile widened. "Mr. Dantes, do you want to go together? Take a look at the children who had the chance of changing their fates due to your ideas and kindness. Oh, some of them are already young adults." Although Klein had never thought of obtaining anything in return from the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation, he truly wished that these actions could help the target group. Therefore, he was rather concerned about the progress and the actual situation. He nodded with a smile after some hesitation. "I have no way of rejecting such an invitation." The group went out the door, and under Miss Audrey's suggestion, they chose an untracked public carriage. After getting into the carriage, Klein, in a gentlemanly-like manner, let Miss Audrey sit down first. Then, he sat opposite her and asked with a smile, "You seem to be very used to it?" Audrey looked at the foundation's staff beside her and said with a smile, "It's not the first time. It's impossible for us to take my own carriage every time we head out. They have to use public transportation." Upon saying that, she blushed in embarrassment and said, "The first time I was on a public carriage, I took out notes with £1 face value. The lady who collected the money got me to buy a few copies of newspapers before going back to her. Oh, it's cleaner than I imagined. The smell of the air isn't that unbearable either." Klein nodded slightly and said, "This is because the truly poor are unable to take public transport like this. They'd rather walk. Under normal circumstances, they don't have to head out, nor do they go somewhere too far." "Mr. Dantes, you seem to be familiar with such matters?" Although Audrey had guessed the reason, she still asked in front of others. Klein smiled. "Although I've never experienced it directly, I've seen too much of it." Audrey didn't continue on the topic. Instead, she mentioned to the beneficiaries that they were visiting to confirm their education and living conditions. Amidst their idle chat, they arrived at their first destination, Backlund University of Technology. Based on Audrey's identity and Dwayne Dantes's social relations, they met the chancellor of the newly established university directly. He was a resident of 100 Backlund Street, Mr. Portland Moment. This elder had a large build, a ruddy complexion, and a loud voice. Whenever he talked to his neighbor, Dwayne Dantes, and the distinguished Miss Audrey about the university's establishment, he would complain about the Higher Education Commission from time to time. Audrey and Klein listened with a decent smile and occasionally echoed his words. Finally, they found an opportunity to raise the need to begin work. Portland was just about to get his secretary when he suddenly heard someone knock on his office door. "Please come in," the chancellor said loudly. The door opened without a sound. A black-haired, brown-eyed girl entered. She didn't doll herself up and was rather thin. She had nice facial features, and she looked to be 17 or 18. Klein's gaze suddenly deepened before he reined it in. The girl hadn't expected the chancellor's office to have guests. In her anxiety, she hurriedly lowered her head and said, "I'm sorry." "It's fine. They were about to leave anyway," Portland said without minding it. "Have you finished the item I got you to make last week?" "Fies." The girl walked through the door and stood to the side. Portland then smiled at Dwayne Dantes and Audrey. "Her name is Melissa Moretti. She's very talented with machinery. I happened to chance upon her and got her to help in my laboratory. Of course, she can only do some miscellaneous chores for now." "Not bad." The corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he commended her with an obvious smile. Audrey glanced at him and smiled. There are always arrogant people who say that women have no talent in machinery, and this lady has proven them wrong. Portland laughed and shook his head. "There's no need to bother about such comments. All right, I'll get my secretary to help you in understanding the conditions of those beneficiaries." Audrey and Klein didn't stay any longer as they left the office. Once they were out the door, Audrey stole a glance at Dwayne Dantes, but she didn't say a word. 1016 News from the Numinous Episcopate 160 Buckland Street, inside Dwayne Dantes's mansion. Klein stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching as the rain began to descend along with the wind. The rain hit the ground and the glass, intersecting to form a mesh. Ever since autumn, Buckland had started to rain again. It brought with it a lingering coldness and humidity. Klein stood there motionless for a long time, watching silently into the distance through the blurry rainy scene, his eyes unfocused. Only when his spiritual perception was triggered did he stop his wandering thoughts and turned his head to the side. Rionette, with the 4 blonde, red-eyed heads in her hand, had a letter as she walked out of the void. "Who is it from this time?" Klein asked Miss Messenger out of habit. The last letter he received came from Sharon. The lady had told him that she had successfully completed the ritual and advanced to sequence 4 puppet of the prisoner pathway. Klein first sincerely congratulated her and apologetically informed her that he had already obtained what he needed and didn't need to visit Calderon City in the spirit world anytime soon. Of course, he also indicated that there was a huge secret there that might have something to do with him. He would probably head there one day, and when that time came, if Miss Sharon had the time or was willing, he wished to obtain her support. For Klein, on the one hand, he might have to head there to find the future ingredients he needed for his advancement. On the other hand, he believed that the magical city that involved ancient death, Phoenix ancestor Greg race, also might contain the method to heal Mr. Azek's incomplete spirit bodies. Even if this death consul didn't have the means to advance, he hoped that by doing so, the former didn't need to repeatedly suffer the torment of losing his memories. Of course, Klein had prepared a plan for that. It was to wait until he advanced to sequence 3 Scholar of Yore. He could prepare more yesterday once more charms for Mr. Azek, or he could imbue him with the corresponding Beyonder powers to speed up the recovery of his memories each time. At that moment, Klein had already received a letter. Rionette Tinker's 4 heads replied one after another, from that undying idiot, Patrick Bryan of the Numinous Episcopate's Artificial Death faction. Klein easily understood who Miss Messenger was referring to. This was because Patrick was the one who wrote the most to him over the past 2 months. He reported almost anything of slight importance and asked for instructions. After a few times, Rionette Tinker gave him a nickname. Miss Messenger never showed interest in such matters before. I wonder when it began. Most of the people who write to me have been given nicknames except Miss Sharon. As Klein silently mumbled, he unfurled the letter and gave it a quick scan. In the letter, Patrick Bryan said that the Southern Continent's orders were no longer about getting him to make various attempts to awaken death. Instead, they got him to prepare a special ritual and help the death domain angel inside the mausoleum, artificial death faction's leader, Hayter, recover. It was to allow him to have the means to temporarily leave the land in which he sealed himself. Such an order didn't seem problematic on the surface, but it was a little sudden. However, Klein still sensed something amiss. The artificial death faction of the numinous episcopate in the southern continent had previously made Patrick continue the strange but dangerous rituals to awaken death. I managed to trick them by instructing him to use excuses such as the inability to gather the materials or the ultimate failure of the experiment. Now, they've finally suspected that there's something wrong with Patrick? Klein nodded in thought. He suspected that this was a test directed at Patrick Bryan, a test that pointed towards an angel. An angel's response to rituals covered the entire world. Yes, it's good as long as they don't suspect there's a problem with artificial death. After all, they've inherited a huge inheritance from the ancient Balaam Empire. Who knows if they have a way to affect the goddess's progress in controlling the death pathway's uniqueness? It could be a bane for both sides. Klein analyzed for a moment before heaving a sigh of relief. As for the test by the death domain angel, he didn't think much of it. This was because the fool could also direct power at the same level. With Angel's embrace, a disruption effect could be made. As long as the high priest named Hayter didn't descend in person and only exerted influence remotely, he could carry out misdirections in an ingenious manner. After figuring this out, Klein flicked his wrist, igniting Patrick Bryan's letter with scarlet flames. As he returned to his desk, he took out a pen and paper and wrote, "You may proceed according to your teacher's instructions, but before the actual ritual, you must report this to me and gain my permission." As the interval between the receiving and sending of letters were short, Patrick Bryan likely remained in his original spot. Klein didn't summon Patrick's messenger and instead blew the adventurer's harmonica and handed the folded letter to Rionette Tynker. Amidst the drizzle, Zio draped a simple raincoat lined with tree sap over her and hid in the shadows, staring at the side door of Viscount Stratford's residence. It wasn't even evening, but the street lamps were already lit up. They emitted a faint glow in the rain. After a while, a rental carriage drove over from afar and stopped in front of the side door in a remote area. The Viscount's valet that had been hiding immediately ran out, opening an umbrella. He sheltered the cloaked woman down the carriage and quickly passed through the side door. As for the rental carriage, it remained in its spot without leaving. It had apparently been paid a sufficient amount of money. Zio still failed to see the woman's appearance, but she wasn't disheartened by it. She patiently waited in the cold rain as though she had turned into a motionless statue. She planned on attempting to tail the woman once she came out to confirm her identity. This was both an opportunity for her to obtain the Judge Potion formula, and it was also the reason why she came to Backlund, to investigate the truth of her father's death. And it was because she was spurred by such motives that Zio had persisted in monitoring Viscount Stratford to this day. MI9's other intelligence officers had already ended the mission due to the lack of any developments over the previous few months. Even the golden-masked man who had designated the mission hadn't asked about this in weeks. Clearly, he didn't place any importance on it. Inside Viscount Stratford's bedroom, a beautiful brown-haired girl wore a silk gown and sat in front of a dressing table. She was fiddling with the skincare and makeup products as if she had discovered a treasure trove. Viscount Stratford, who was already middle-aged, wore a male nightgown and walked to the beautiful girl with his hair still moist. He smiled at her reflection in the mirror and said, "Charmaine, you no longer need those to add to your beauty. It's just a type of female instinct." The young girl named Charmaine raised her hand with a smile, pressing down on the Viscount's palm that had been placed on her shoulder. Viscount Stratford smiled gently and said, "When you touch them, you have a pure and innocent air to you. Ha ha, you make me discover my youth, like the days when I was only 18. Without waiting for Charmaine's reply, he continued, "My wife had already passed away for years. I always imagined I would live until the Lord beckons for me, but who knew that I would meet you? In a while, when the pressure accumulated in Backlund is relieved, I will find a chance to walk down the wedding aisle to the altar with you." "Wedding? You want to marry me?" Charmaine was taken aback as she asked in disbelief. Viscount Stratford smiled and said, "Meeting you is a gift from the Lord. Although you aren't of noble birth, I've already married once." I don't have to consider such matters anymore. Of course, I'll think of means to raise your standing in society. Yes, I'll first find a merchant to recognize you as his illegitimate daughter. He droned on about his plan until he saw Charmaine's eyes filled with tears in the mirror's reflection. The most precious thing about you is that you treat me 10 times better than how well I treat you, and you don't hide it. Viscount Stratford smiled as he lowered his head and kissed the top of Charmaine's head. Charmaine opened her mouth, seemingly crying and laughing. Only when the drizzle stopped and night fell did Zio finally wait for the woman in a dark red cloak walk out and board the carriage. After memorizing the carriage's traits, Zio tailed it from afar, using her beyonder powers as a sheriff and the empty streets at night to follow the target simply by walking or running. She went all the way from Empress Borough to the Backland Bridge area. Even with her stamina, she was almost at her limit, but thankfully, the carriage finally came to a stop. Zio brightened up as she switched her target from the carriage to the cloaked woman and continued tailing her. During this process, she was surprised that the woman had very good anti-tracking abilities. She would occasionally take detours and pause using obstacles. However, this didn't stump Zio, since she was already an experienced sheriff. She patiently tailed from afar without coming too close. Just as she sensed that the woman wasn't too far from her final destination and that she was finally about to catch up to her, she suddenly caught the scent of a sweet, ethereal fragrance. Zio's mind went into a daze amidst the fragrance before she completely lost track of her target. As for the fragrance, it had vanished as though it had never appeared. Zio's pupils widened slightly. She didn't dare to search her surroundings for any traces. Inside a rental apartment, Trissy, with a gentle and sweet face that made one unable to resist looking at her, looked at the mirror reflecting Charmaine and said, "You seem to be in a good mood. How was it? This final mission isn't too unacceptable, right? Once you complete it, you can leave Backland and start your own life." Charmaine was taken aback as her expression turned complicated as though she was disheartened. It was as though she had suddenly snapped out of her dreams. She didn't turn her head as her lips quivered while replying, "He said that he wishes to marry me." Trissy immediately pricked up her brows. "You mustn't believe a man's words during those times. You and I should know this very well. If he really wishes to marry you, he wouldn't be wary of you. He will wish to have a child with you." Did he do so?" Upon hearing her question, Charmaine's mood turned sullen. Trissy stood up and said with a smile, "I'm not stopping you from pursuing your love. If you wish to turn this temporary mission into a permanent one, you should think about what needs to be done." After ethereally finishing her sentence, she walked to the door and left the rented apartment. While heading down the staircase, Trissy suddenly noticed her shoes. She chuckled and said in a seemingly self-deprecating manner, "Love." 1017 Mager Manor, Backland, Empress Borough, in the outskirts towards the northwest. This was a place that needed more than an hour via horse carriage. Mager Manor was built by the side of the Tussock River, so it had beautiful scenery around it with flourishing vegetation within its confines. Strangely enough, Backland city areas had perennial rain with relatively few sunny days. However, in the outskirts, the clouds tended to be thin, and the sun was always bright. Despite the short distance, the two places had completely different weather. It was most obvious within the northwestern outskirts. It was even a rather famous grape plantation in the northern continent. And by following the Tussock River from this region northwest for another 50 kilometers, one would again encounter weather similar to Backland's city area. Such situations left meteorologists puzzled. They couldn't find any suitable theories to explain the reason. However, Klein had a vague guess. In the Fourth Epoch, this was the capital of the Tudor-Tronsoist United Empire. It was also here that Blood Emperor Alista abandoned his humanity and became a crazy deity. Therefore, it was normal that the weather and terrain had changed forever in those very small confines. Leonard Mitchell had once mentioned information about this during one of the free exchanges. Furthermore, as an area with a long history and signs of early human activity, this land of hope buried countless ancient ruins. It was very possible that they could have an influence on the weather. The carriage drove into Mager Manor, passing by the fountain pond and small garden that was surrounded by the main building. Finally, it stopped outside the main door. Just as Klein got off the carriage with butler Walter, he saw the land steward, Richardson, lead 2 rows of male and female servants by the door, awaiting their employer. Compared to 160 Buckland Street, there were more servants here, but they were mainly lower-class servants. Looking at Richardson wearing a spanking new suit, Klein nodded with a smile. "Well done." Without waiting for Richardson to reply, he took off his hat and handed it along with his cane to his valet, Enuni, while asking, "Have you prepared the activity room for the ladies to chat and for men to play cards in?" "Yes, sir." Eve placed poker cards, tarot cards, and some board games. The piano, violins, and other common musical instruments have also been moved inside, Richardson answered eloquently. Klein passed through the door and nodded. "Where's the smoking room for the gentlemen?" "Like the ladies, it's all on the 2nd floor. They're separated by 5 rooms." Richardson didn't need the servants in the manor to remind him. He didn't even need to recall to give an answer. To ensure that his employer's first hunting excursion was flawless, he had taken note of every nitty-gritty detail. Although it exhausted him physically, he was excited mentally. Klein asked about dinner and the guest rooms and confirmed that everything was in place. Before long, he received the first batch of guests after Mager Manor had a change of name, now known as Dante's Manor. Member of Parliament Mocht and his family. "This place is much bigger than my Moose Manor." Mocht took off his coat with a smile and handed it to a servant while praising, "I've always heard of Mager's wine being of excellent quality, but I've never had the chance of tasting it. I can finally have my curiosity satisfied today. I hope you won't be disappointed." Klein smiled modestly. As a famous area for grape plantations in the northern continent, champagne, red wine, and white wine were considered the finest in Backland's northwestern outskirts. But with the manor here mainly owned by the nobles, self-brewed alcoholic beverages were typically not sold to the public. Therefore it was almost unheard of. Only people from high society or those related to them would know of this. Mager was one of the most iconic manors. The wine that it brewed was widely praised by people in the know. Red wine of certain years was even offered at more than £100 a bottle by collectors. However, for Klein to be able to buy this manor for £20,000, he naturally had to agree to certain conditions. All the wine from certain years were to be taken away by Duke Negan's servants. Mocht was rather clear about this and didn't expect to drink famous wine commodities. He said with a laugh, "You can open a few bottles and pour a small glass of each for me. Let me decide which of the remaining wine is most spectacular." As a member of high society, he had never tasted the wine of Mager Manor. The reason was simple: he was a member of the new party, and the previous owner, Duke Negan, was the main sponsor of the Conservative Party. "No problem," Klein immediately agreed as his gaze swept across Hazel's face. Compared to July and August, this girl had clearly cheered up. She no longer felt apprehensive when facing strangers. Previously, it was as bad as not willing to participate in any banquets or balls. This made those familiar with her think she was sick. And this was all thanks to Audrey. Whenever she met Dwayne Dantes at the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation, she had mentioned that she had recently met Miss Hazel Mocht twice. Such communication didn't seem problematic at first glance, since Hazel was a common acquaintance of Audrey and Dantes. Finding a topic about a common friend was common in idle chatter. However, Klein could read Miss Justice's hints and understood that she had met Hazel twice at different balls and banquets and had treated her twice. After getting Mocht's family settled in, Klein welcomed the second batch of guests for the weekend hunting trip, Brigadier General Kona's Kilgore, who had come with a friend that he had previously mentioned. Klein knew this friend, but he didn't know Dwayne Dantes. He was a steam car mogul from his cage. He was one of the main investors of the bicycle project. He had relied on a lawyer suspected to be a beyonder with the lawyer sequence and had bought the 10% shares from Sherlock Moriarty at a cheap price. Since he's related to a lawyer, it can be explained how he's an Earl of the Fallen's friend. Klein went forward with a smile and hugged Brigadier General Konas and from his cage. "Welcome." He then stepped back and said to the portly, light blue-eyed Fromis, who was a quarter Fasak, "I heard your steam car is very famous. Why didn't you drive it over?" Before Fromis could answer, the manly Konas Kilgore said with a smile. No, you don't understand him. He will never give up the chance to showcase his steam car. However, the car's too heavy. On the way here, it fell into a ditch and couldn't be pulled out. Thankfully, I never believed his claims and rode on a carriage myself, following behind him. Otherwise, he would have had to cover the remaining distance on foot. The main problem is that our roads are terrible. They need to be renovated and rebuilt. They need metal tracks to be paved, just like steam locomotives. Framiz retorted and threw his hands up. I was planning on seeking some investments from you. How we can talk about it later. You were the one who invested in us previously, but now you're asking me for an investment. Only then did Klein realize that he was a rather famous tycoon in the upper class of the kingdom. He had donated shares worth more than £10,000 and had purchased an expensive manor. He had also established connections with the military, so it was obvious he was rich. But in fact, my current net worth is only 50 to 60,000 gold pounds, perhaps a tenth of Miss Justice's wealth. I wonder when I can really become a tycoon with a net worth of £1 million. Klein thought in a self-deprecating manner. After some thought, he said, It's fine. I'm very interested in the fusion of machinery and steam. When I'm free, I can take a look at your steam car. Spectacular, Framiz immediately said with a smile. If I didn't know that you had donated a large sum to the Church of Evernight, I might even think of you as a believer of the god of steam. I've drawn the triangular sacred emblem on my chest in the past after all. Klein didn't continue on this topic, afraid that Konas would discover his intentions. He pointed to the staircase and said, Why don't you head to the smoking room to try some of the prized cigar collections here? It wasn't until I bought this manor that I learned that there was a room specially for storing cigars. Its temperature and humidity are maintained, but as you know, I can smoke, but I don't like it. Not bad. Do you have chieftain? Konas Kilgore's face suffused a smile. Of course. Klein gave a positive answer. There was only one goal in organizing this hunting trip. It was to hunt this Brigadier General, Deputy Director of MI9. Therefore, he had taken into consideration all his preferences. However, Klein wasn't in a hurry to take action for this hunting trip. This was because he still lacked an understanding of Konas Kilgore's actual strength as a hidden demigod. He needed more gatherings and hunts to figure out his preferences, level of alertness, and the items he brought with him. As a magician, Klein didn't perform unprepared. In an apartment in Sherwood Borough, Furs put down the book in her hand and looked at Zio, who was pacing around the activity room. She couldn't help but ask, What are you troubled about? Zio shot her a glance and said, I'm frustrated over whether to inform MI9 about Viscount Stratford's close relationship with an unknown woman, or to keep it from them until there's further development. Why are you keeping it from them? Furs first asked in return before giving her answer. Viscount Stratford is related to your father's death, but you normally lack the opportunity or strength to confront him, afraid of being exposed and affecting your mother and brother. And now, he might encounter an accident because of that unknown woman. He's in a relatively easy-to-deal-with state. This is your opportunity, so you're being hesitant, right? Zio fell silent for a moment before saying, Yes. Furs closed the book, stared at her friend, and said in a serious manner, Since you're hesitating, it means you're already inclined towards one option. Zio slowly nodded and said, Yes. Furs fondled her slightly long curly hair and stood up, extending her right hand, and said, I already know your decision. Well, do you need help? Seeing Zio hesitant to give an answer, she laughed and said, I'm a Sequence 6 Beyonder. Without waiting for Zio to answer, she looked around. If you're worried, we can still seek additional help. She was implying that they could get help from the members of the Tarot Club. Zio thought about it and exhaled. Not for now. Let's try it first. Let's head out now and continue monitoring Viscount Stratford. Now. Furs was taken aback. All right, but before that, let me use the crystal ball to do some astromancy to confirm the level of danger. After some work, she held the pure crystal ball in one hand and said, There's a certain level of danger. 1018 Unexpected Empress Borough, by the side of Viscount Stratford's mansion. Furs and Zio, who were dressed in black dresses, hid in a dark corner. They stared intently at the tightly closed metal gates as they patiently waited for their target to appear. It wasn't raining tonight, so they didn't have to face harsh weather conditions. The carriage that remained parked by the side of the street lamps made it clear to them that their patience would be rewarded. It was only a matter of time. After an unknown period of time, the gates produced a heavy metal groan as they slowly opened. A figure in a black cloak appeared with its head bowed. The figure walked to the side of the carriage and nimbly boarded the carriage. "Is that her?" Furs lowered her voice and asked Zio. She didn't have beyonder powers that could restore a target's characteristics from a mere description, and she had never seen her before. Therefore, she couldn't rely on her spiritual intuition or astromancy to make a judgment. Zio nodded in affirmation and said, "Yes." As they quietly conversed, the rental carriage sped up and left the side gates. Zio immediately left her hiding spot, prepared to use her sheriff's beyonder powers and the physical enhancement that being an interrogator gave her to lock onto her target while jogging. "What are you doing?" At that moment, Furs pressed down on her shoulder, foiling her plans. "Track her." Zio looked back at her friend in puzzlement. Furs looked at the rental carriage that hadn't completely pulled away from them and asked thoughtfully, "Why are you tracking her for? Also, didn't you say that the target has a rather powerful beyonder protecting her once you enter the Backlund Bridge area?" "That's right." Zio first answered the second question before saying, "Your question is very odd. The reason you track someone is to determine the target's appearance, identity, and motives." Furs retracted her left hand from Zio's shoulder and revealed a smile. "Since the target is protected by a rather powerful beyonder, it will be difficult for us to complete the tracking in the Backlund Bridge area. We won't be able to find her residence and figure out her true identity. Do you wish to directly fight her guardian? Although you have me to help, are you certain about that person's strength? How certain are you? Will it be very dangerous? Besides, once the battle begins, it will definitely alarm the target. This is the same as stopping the carriage midway and confronting her directly. It will foil your primary objective. It will alarm Viscount Stratford and prevent him from falling into a predicament that will offer you a chance to take action. If we do it, then there's a possibility of failure, but failure is certain if we do nothing." Zio emphasized that she knew the situation well. All she wanted was to make an attempt and find an opportunity midway. At this moment, the rental carriage had already turned into another street at the end of the road. Furs watched the back of it gradually disappear as she shook her head and smiled. No, we need to change our way of thinking. We should first attempt to figure out the target's appearance. After daybreak, we can use her appearance to perform normal investigations in the Backlund Bridge area and then obtain information from other channels." "Your choice of words is very professional," Zio said in thought. "Of course, I've written detective novels before." Furs answered without any sense of modesty. "But how do I figure out what the target looks like without alerting her?" Zio raised the most critical question. Prepared, Furs took out Lamino's travels and said with a smile, "Elementary. Using the psychological invisibility Miss Justice recorded." Although Audrey didn't encounter any situations that required her to use Lamino's travels, she had rented it thrice out of curiosity. She studied the uses and traits of the beyonder powers recorded, and she recorded her own beyonder powers into it. This included the rather useful psychological invisibility. As for her true identity, Zio and Furs were increasingly certain of it, but they didn't directly ask or do any further investigations. That was the most basic form of respect towards other Tarot Club members. After hearing her friend's answer, Zio came to a realization and was instantly inspired. Furs continued, "By using the beyonder powers on this page, you will be placed in the sensory blind spots of all surrounding creatures. They wouldn't be able to see you even if you were to jump around in front of them. That way, you can directly board the carriage and stand in front of the target, openly taking in her appearance and remember all her traits." Haha, I sometimes think that people who use psychological invisibility might end up being squashed to death by huge creatures that happen to walk past if they're unlucky. Don't make too much noise later. Don't speak to any nearby creatures, or else you will garner attention. Let psychological invisibility be dispelled automatically. Yeah. Zio nodded, then she raised another issue. How do I prevent the target from discovering the sudden opening of the carriage door while it's driving? Without waiting for Furza's reply, she immediately pressed, Did you record the door opening beyond her power? Yes. Furz smiled as she handed Lamino's travels to her friend, telling her which pages psychological invisibility and door opening were on. With this in mind, Zio immediately ran amidst the shadows, chasing after the rental carriage. Before long, she saw her target. Her right hand immediately trembled as she made the bronze-green notebook reveal a yellowish-brown goatskin page. She slid her fingers gently, and Zio seemed to see countless rippling light appear on the surface of a deep lake spread outwards. When her vision returned to normal, she sped up and rushed to the side of the carriage. To ensure nothing went wrong, Zio didn't immediately take action. With a few wide strides, she overtook the horse. She then turned around as though she was crossing the road. However, the carriage driver didn't notice her, nor did he shout out to her or rein in the horse. After confirming the effects of psychological invisibility, she sped up and dodged the horse's galloping and came to the side of the carriage. After a brief observation, she flipped through Lamino's travels and revealed a white page covered with strange patterns and symbols. Then, she reached out her right hand and pressed it on the surface of the carriage. Her figure instantly turned transparent as she appeared inside. The woman in a black cloak was sitting diagonally opposite her as if she was in thought, staring at the glass window where Zio stood. However, she didn't notice the bounty hunter who had suddenly infiltrated. At such a close distance, even with her cloak lowered, Zio was able to see her face clearly. Furthermore, the woman wasn't as careful as she was while walking outside. Her every action appeared rather casual as the hood was only at her eyes. Instantly, her appearance was reflected in Zio's eyes, overlapping with a face that still had some male characteristics. This was a beyonder power of a sheriff. Zio's eyes widened as she couldn't help but shout, Sherman? She could foresee that the woman who often entered Viscount Stratford's residence was rather beautiful, but she never expected the woman to be her friend, Sherman. He was once a young man. A man who wasn't considered androgynous now looked beautiful. He had the charm of a woman. At that moment, Zio couldn't help but size up Sherman. She couldn't associate her figure with the young man she used to know with each other. If it wasn't for her sheriff beyonder powers that allowed her to confirm that the person opposite her was Sherman, Zio definitely would have imagined that she had made a mistake. And even so, she still suspected whether the person wasn't Sherman and was instead Sherman's twin sister. Upon hearing the surprised question, Sherman realized that there was another person in the carriage at some point in time, someone familiar. Bounty hunter, Zio Derja. Having already changed her name to Shermaine, she was first alarmed, but the words Trissy often mentioned instinctively appeared in her mind. You cannot meet people you used to know. Do you want your husband, your beloved, to know of your former state? Only by completely severing your connections can you be reborn, doing so in order to save yourself. Such words quickly flashed across Shermaine's mind as a terrifying thought emerged in her thoughts. Kill her. This thought seemed to come from a demon in the abyss as it constantly whispered in Shermaine's ear as it resonated in her heart. Kill her. Kill this person who recognized you. Only by doing so can you truly escape the past and not lose the present. Kill her. Shermaine didn't answer Zio's question. Her left hand slowly clenched up while slightly trembling. Zio sensed the intense emotions running through the person opposite her and confirmed that it was Sherman. Immediately, she asked in concern, How did you become like this? Where have you been all this time? Did you encounter something? Were you hurt? Shermaine's lips quivered as her left fist relaxed a little. She said with a sobbing tone, I've already begun a new life. Don't disturb me again, all right? I don't want to lose everything I have now. I don't want to see people that I knew in the past. The more she spoke, the faster it became. It became obvious that it was a plea. Zio was taken aback for a few seconds before staring at Sherman. Pursing her lips, she said, Okay. She didn't stay any longer and reached out to open the carriage window and jumped out. Charmaine silently watched this entire process and finally exhaled before she slumped into her seat like she had lost all her strength. It wasn't easy for her to control the demon in her heart. At this moment, she saw a figure rapidly outline itself out of thin air beside her. The figure wore a black, old-fashioned dress, but it didn't diminish her beauty and disposition. She sat there silently without a word, but it was impossible to not look at her. "Demoness Trissy, why didn't you kill her?" Trissy asked with a smile, not revealing any gloominess. It was as like an idle chat where she would ask what she had drunk the previous night. "She's one of the few people who didn't ostracize me. She even helped me," Charmaine replied in shock before frowning. "Why are you here?" Trissy smiled and said, "I'm protecting you." Without waiting for Charmaine's answer, she said, "You seemed to be in a good mood when you came out." Charmaine recalled what had happened and bashfully said, "Maybe, perhaps, I have a chance of becoming a mother." As she spoke, she touched her stomach with her right hand. The corner of her lips couldn't help but curl. "I feel him kicking me." Charmaine suddenly froze and blurted, "How could it be so fast?" She wasn't sure if she could get pregnant today. Upon seeing her reaction, Trissy smiled even more charmingly. Chapter 1019 Patience. How was it? Did you take a good look? Just as Furs left the street where Viscount Stratford's mansion was, she saw Zio walk out with a down and vacant expression. Zio nodded hesitantly. "I did." Having said that, she seemed to come to her senses and said in shock, "I know her, know him." "Him?" Furs was confused. Zio habitually observed her surroundings before saying, "He's Sherman. The Sherman I told you about. He actually became a woman." Furs was stunned as she subconsciously asked, "Were you mistaken? Could she be Sherman's sister?" Zio firmly shook her head. "No, she admitted it herself and even told me not to disturb her. She wants to bid farewell to her past." "But how did he become a woman?" Furs's eyes darted around as she suddenly recalled something. She said in thought, "It's not impossible either. There's a beyonder pathway that allows a man to become a woman at a certain stage." She recalled Miss Justice mentioning something similar during a free exchange session. "Ah, really?" Zio's widened as she asked in disbelief. Furs had already recalled the exact conditions as she gave a rather confident answer. Zio was momentarily unable to accept it, but she couldn't find a rebuttal. All she could do was ask, "Which pathway is it?" Furs replied, "Demoness." It's the assassin pathway." "Demoness? Sherman actually became a demoness," Zio repeated to herself. Suddenly, her voice became louder. "Could it be that she's being taken advantage of? No, I must warn her." Just as she said that, Zio turned around and ran with great strides in an attempt to catch up with the rental carriage again. However, she couldn't find the target after attempting to pursue it for a few blocks. Sherman and the carriage seemed to have disappeared into thin air. Zio gradually slowed down and finally stopped. She looked at the bustling streets ahead of her with a complicated expression. Behind her, Furs passed through a few walls and finally caught up to her. "Gone," Zio whispered. Furs also cast her gaze forward and thoughtfully replied, "We were discovered." Without waiting for Zio to speak, she turned around and sighed. "Let's return and find another opportunity." Zio didn't take a step forward as she continued standing there. After a few seconds, she said under Furs's puzzled gaze, "Since they discovered a problem, will they speed up their plans ahead of time?" "It's possible. If they don't wish for their plans to be foiled, they might attempt one final strike tonight before we're prepared." Furs immediately agreed with Zio. "Let's return to Viscount Stratford's place and hide in a more concealed spot. We'll continue monitoring it." Zio immediately nodded and replied without any hesitation, "Okay." In the dock area, inside a warehouse with plenty of goods, Charmaine was sitting on a dirty wooden crate. Her hands were crossed behind her back as her body had thin but firm spider webs coiled around her. She appeared as though she was encased in a transparent cocoon, unable to make a single sound. "It's not a bad thing for you." Trissy stood in front of Charmaine with a pitch-black flame that resembled ink burning in her palm. "At the very least, You can determine if he really loves you or is lying to you. Charmaine was angry and afraid. She desperately used her whimpers to express her wish, but Trissy was unmoved. She turned her flame-wielding palm around and pressed it into Charmaine's stomach. The flames seemed to have intelligence as they scattered like flowing water. Following that, they penetrated her skin and flesh in an attempt to drill inside. Trissy's smooth, black hair flared up in defiance of the laws of nature. They were being pulled by invisible hands as they extended out in every direction. It stained the surrounding air with a peculiar smell. The strands of hair thickened as they scattered into distinct strands. Beneath them, dark beams of light surged, bringing about curses and words. They flowed rapidly, fusing into the pitch-black flames. Upon entering Charmaine's stomach, they quickly vanished. Charmaine's face twitched uncontrollably, but she didn't feel any pain. It was as though it was purely on reflex. She soon calmed down as she saw Trissy's figure turn faint and gradually turn transparent until it vanished. Charmaine's pupils widened as she struggled again, but she was unable to break free from her restraints. She tried again and again like a flood was rising, centimeter by centimeter, inside the silent warehouse. After an unknown period of time, the door to the warehouse opened with a thud and slammed into the two sides of the wall. A figure staggered in. It was the middle-aged Viscount Stratford. He didn't wear his white wig like he always did while outside. This revealed his rather high receding hairline and rather messy black hair. The latter was stuck together as though it had been drenched by a storm and was air-dried. But in the past few hours, the clouds were thin and the crimson moon high in the sky. It hadn't rained at all. Drops of sweat dripped down Viscount Stratford's rather cut facial contours as there were countless black threads flowing beneath his skin. His body was slightly hunched, and his facial muscles were somewhat twisted. His eyes were filled with pain and concern. He surveyed the area and was delighted when he found Charmaine. However, he turned anxious as he charged over without much confidence. When Charmaine saw him enter the warehouse, her face lit up as though it was covered in a halo. She then revealed a worried and fearful expression as she attempted to shake her head frantically. However, her neck was held firmly by the spider webs that prevented her movement. She reeled in anxiety, to the point of tears flowing out of her eyes, drop after drop, crystalline and frail. Just as Viscount Stratford was about to reach her, a loud bang suddenly rang out between the two. It was as though there was an invisible wall that separated him from Charmaine, one that couldn't be surpassed. If you wish to break the curse and take her away, you have to answer my question without hiding anything. At this moment, a figure quickly appeared in a corner of the warehouse. Her facial features were charming, forming together into an abnormally sweet look. She resembled the lover that every young lad would fantasize about in his youth. She was none other than Demoness Trissy. Without waiting for Viscount Stratford's response, she raised her right hand and conjured a pitch-black flame. Viscount Stratford's face, hands, neck, and exposed skin instantly turned transparent as they protruded with blood vessels. And in every blood vessel, there was a black flame silently burning as it flowed silently. The pain in Viscount Stratford's eyes immediately reached a peak, but it vanished the next moment. His expression turned extremely cold as a gibing look appeared in his eyes. It was as though the one being cursed wasn't him, but Trissy, who was a distance away. Trissy, who was in the corner of the warehouse, suddenly burst into black flames. Dense, countless spiderwebs appeared, but they couldn't be lit up. In the blink of an eye, Trissy was like Charmaine, being sealed inside a transparent cocoon. She couldn't move or escape. In a ventilation vent high above the warehouse, a figure appeared. It was a woman whose age wasn't obvious. She wore a simple and sacred white robe. She had black hair, blue eyes, looking sweet and beautiful, giving off an indescribable charm. Katerina Pell, Trissy seemed to expend all her strength before she shouted a name. At this moment, Viscount Stratford grabbed at his body, pulling out an illusory doll covered in thick black flames. He glanced at Charmaine and smiled at Trissy. When it comes to matters related to life, I would never be careless. After that fellow, Sykes, died, I knew that it would be my turn one day. Heh, since you're hunting me, It means there are obviously others who wish to hunt you. We're very patient, afraid of scaring you away. We did nothing and waited until today. Also, your gift was pretty good." Upon hearing Viscount Stratford's words, Charmaine, who was still struggling out of habit, instantly stopped moving. Her expression turned blank. Her eyes widened, but there wasn't any focus. The look in her eyes seemed to sink deeper and deeper. "Love," Trissy suddenly laughed, seemingly mocking herself. She wasn't nervous at all. Mager Manor. Night had fallen. After settling more than 20 guests and preparing the hunting trip the next day, Klein woke up not long after he fell asleep. His intuition had been triggered as a scene formed in his mind. Brigadier General Konas Kilgore, who was wearing a shirt and pants, had flown out of the guest room's window in secret. He landed outside in complete defiance of the laws of nature. "I haven't even taken action. He came here for his own goals." With a thought, Klein controlled a cockroach outside and turned it into his marionette. He then used its eyes to observe the surroundings. Almost at the same time, Konas Kilgore appeared. After this demigod left Mager Manor, he immediately distorted the distance and quickly arrived by the bank of the Tussock River. He prepared himself to cross it. The cockroach watched quietly without any reaction. He's heading for the south bank of the Tussock River. What does he want to do? Does he have the preference of hunting in the suburbs so that he can attempt to conceal such actions? He also introduced Mager Manor to me for this reason? Klein lay in bed and seriously analyzed Konas's actions. After the Mi-9 demigod stepped onto the south bank of the Tussock River, Klein suddenly recalled a matter. Back when he escaped the underground ruins wherein Zangwill and company were, he appeared somewhere in the northwest of Backland. This was the south bank of the Tussock River, making it rather close to where Mager Manor was. Chapter 10:20 Means of a Demoness. As his thoughts raced, Klein suddenly switched positions with his valet, Enuni, who was in the opposite room. And under a grapevine 150 meters from the manor's main building, a slowly crawling centipede suddenly stiffened before it relaxed. Almost at the same time, its body vanished from its location. Dwayne Dante in his blue and white checkered pajamas had appeared. Klein had swapped places with his marionette again. He decided to use this method to secretly tail Konas Kilgore and figure out where he was going or what he was planning on doing. Although he could only move 150 meters at a time, and it took 2 to 3 seconds in between moves, due to the process of turning the target into a marionette, this was more concealed compared to flaming jump or teleport. It made it difficult for Konas Kilgore to detect him. After all, he was dealing with a demigod. Even in domains where one's spiritual intuition wasn't the best, a demigod wasn't to be underestimated. By the same logic, Klein didn't rely on creeping hunger to hide in the shadows. This was because it was relatively slow even though it concealed him rather well. It was impossible for him to catch up to the demigod. Under the dark night sky, from Mager Manor to the south bank of the Tussock River, the rats, snakes, spiders, fish that were active in that stretch of land stiffened up and turned sluggish. They were converted into marionettes one after another. With their help, Klein constantly moved, without causing a stir. Soon he arrived at the south bank of the Tussock River, and after catching up to Konas Kilgore, he maintained a distance of 1 kilometer. To a bizarro sorcerer, even if a marionette were to go beyond his range of control, it wouldn't immediately escape from its controlled state or die immediately. Without a bizarro sorcerer's consciousness as a catalyst, this process was rather slow and needed nearly 10 minutes. Therefore, Klein wasn't worried that he would lose Enuni, who was lying in bed, while he did his tailing. As long as he returned within 10 minutes, he could continue controlling his marionette. Silently, Klein followed Konas Kilgore as they went upstream. Passing through the dense forest, they climbed up a mountain beside the bank. At this moment, Konas Kilgore, who wasn't wearing a vest or coat, suddenly stopped. He checked his surroundings and widened the range of his search as though he was trying to claim his territory. Upon seeing this, Klein didn't dare stay any longer. He immediately switched places with his marionettes and retreated repeatedly, pulling away to a distance of nearly 3 kilometers from the deputy director of Mi-9. At this moment he gave up control of the marionettes ahead of him. the death of a few bugs wouldn't incur any suspicion. This was all too common in the outskirts and in the forests. King of the Five Seas Nast can create a fighting environment that's favorable for him. Will Kona's Kilgore, who's also a Black Emperor pathway demigod, have the ability to demarcate such a region? He can change, boost, and use certain rules and make whoever tails him expose themselves without being able to hide? It's very possible. Klein warily took out a gold coin he placed in his pajama pocket. He ran it through his fingers and flipped it. This time, he deliberately controlled his strength and didn't produce a flicking sound. The gold coin flew up in silence and landed in his palm. Without needing to look down, the gold coin's face was naturally reflected in his mind. It was heads. This meant that the anomaly ahead contained extreme danger, as expected of a demigod. Such abilities sure are enviable. However, do you think you can avoid my tailing? Klein scoffed inwardly and found an abnormally secluded spot and made himself turn into Gehrman Sparrow. Following that, he clasped his hands and pressed it to his mouth, whispering, "Blessed of the sea and spirit world, guardian of the Rörsted archipelago, ruler of the undersea creatures, master of tsunamis and storms, the great Calvetua." After praying, Klein immediately took 4 steps counterclockwise and arrived above the gray fog. He sat at the fool's seat and beckoned for the bone scepter with blue gems embedded at its tip. Then, with the help of his prayer, he utilized the sea god scepters responding to believers and saw the area around Gehrman Sparrow. He then raised his field of view and took in the surrounding area. Using this as the origin, he expanded his vision to 5 nautical miles. This was the limit of what the sea god scepter could observe with the help of its believers. And this way, the area where Kona's Klein had designated, one that no object could escape his notice, appeared in Klein's vision. In the dock area, inside a warehouse with plenty of goods. Love. After Trissy chuckled, her figure grew faint as though she was bathed in the luster of a lake at night. In the blink of an eye, Trissy, who had been bound tightly with layers of silk by demoness of unaging Katarina Pell, turned into an illusory mirror. It was a full-body mirror taller than a person. Aqueous light shimmered within as a ghostly halo grew out of it, as though it was a door leading to another world. At that moment, it didn't reflect the scene in front of it. Instead, it outlined a room. The room was dimly lit. The bed and furniture had been diced up into countless small pieces which were scattered everywhere. Only the central region was spick and span. Trissy stood there, wearing a dark black dress. Her hair cascaded down smoothly as it fluttered in the wind, accentuating her face's abnormal fairness. She looked like a female ghost as spoken in folk tales. She wasn't actually present and was using the illusory mirror to project her figure and strength remotely. It was as though everything was real. Therefore, she wasn't flustered at all when she was being controlled and hunted. Upon seeing this scene, Katarina Pell, who wore simple and holy white robes, didn't hesitate to let out a shriek. Invisible waves quickly spread out as her hair flared up, each strand clear and distinct. They were thick and dyed with a grayish-white color. The illusory full-body mirror suddenly vibrated and shook as though it was on the brink of breaking apart. And in the messy room it reflected, the fragments of the bed, desk, and chairs turned grayish-white, losing their luster as though they were rocks. The brownish-yellow floor in front of Trissy turned into grayish-white rocks as it quickly extended towards the only human in the room like a surging tidal wave. Trissy didn't attempt to resist as she turned around and waved her hand back while leaping towards the open window. In midair, invisible spider webs that belonged to her phased into existence. They turned dark as they spread towards the grayish-white colors. At the same time, the dark and profound full-body mirror produced one crack after another. Amidst illusory shattering sounds, it broke apart and vanished. However, before the full-body mirror completely vanished, the grayish-white colors receded in a strange manner inside the petrified room, materializing into a figure. The figure wore a simple, holy white robe and had luscious raven-black hair. She looked both mature and innocent, as though she had a pair of profound and childlike blue eyes. She was demoness of unaging Katarina, who had just been inside the warehouse a moment ago. Viscount Stratford could no longer see the situation inside the opposite, room once the ghostly glow dissipated. He retracted his gaze and cast it onto Charmaine. He wore a mixed look in his eyes before he recovered. Trissy really was patient. To deal with me, she actually spent months to nurture a new demoness. Viscount Stratford shook his head with a chuckle. What did she want you to gain from me? At that moment, with Trissy's connection being severed, the spider webs around Charmaine had loosened. They were unable to bind her and restrict her freedom. This beautiful girl wore a blank expression as she replied with a vacant look in her eyes. She wanted me to know who you are truly loyal to. Without waiting for Viscount Stratford to say a word, she asked hesitantly, her eyes making it obvious that she had difficulty finding the words, "How many of those promises that you made to me were real?" Viscount Stratford was taken aback before he chuckled. "You're probably the most silly and most naive demoness I've ever met." Charmaine's expression froze on her face as the glimmer in her eyes that she found so hard to regain faded bit by bit. Outside the warehouse, Zio and Furs were hiding in the shadows, observing the silent target area. They had followed Viscount Stratford here. Their patience had paid off, as they discovered this captain of the Royal Guards secretly leaving his mansion in the dead of the night, rushing to the dock area near the Backland Bridge. Using Zio's power as a sheriff, they followed him all the way here by keeping a huge distance between them. They had also confirmed that he had entered the warehouse in front of them. In addition, they also sensed that Viscount Stratford's condition had worsened as though he had been injured. "Actually, we had the opportunity to take action while on our way here." Furs looked at the warehouse's entrance and murmured. Zio replied without looking at her, "But you said it yourself that you have a nagging feeling that things aren't that simple and wanted to wait. This might be the intuition of an astrologer. It might also be an act of procrastination." Furs replied in a self-deprecating manner. They didn't say anything more as silence ruled once more. They continued waiting patiently. At this moment, a pitch-black flame was ignited on the rammed earth in front of them. The strange flames rapidly dispersed and kept close to the ground as it swept away. It then outlined a row of Loanese text. "This is the chance you've been longing for." Zio's and Furz's pupils dilated at the same time. Then, they looked at each other at a loss for words. After a few seconds, Furs finally couldn't help but ask, "What do we do?" Chapter 10:21 Zio hesitated when she heard Furz's question. "We were discovered." They had said something similar before, but they were repeating it again now. However, it didn't have the same meaning. Previously, it was referring to being discovered by the Guardian or Monitor when she recognized Sherman. Now, the crux of the matter was that their choice and corresponding actions were expected and arranged by the person behind the scenes. They had no secrets to speak of. This meant that the chance that Zio had been longing for might have really appeared, but what lay behind this matter was inconceivable. If we follow the intention behind this message, the final outcome will depend on whether she has good intentions, but that's not something under our control, Zio added from a rational angle. The reason why she had used she to represent the person behind the scenes was because she had recalled the fragrance she smelled when she lost Sherman the other time. Furs listened quietly and nodded in agreement. "Yes, we're too passive in this matter. The best option is to leave this place." As soon as she finished speaking, she looked at the warehouse. She opened her mouth but didn't say anything further. She was reminded of the possible situation Sherman was in, and she suspected that he was in grave danger. However, she deliberately ignored it in the end and didn't mention it. To her, Sherman was a person who existed in Zio's descriptions. He was no different from a character in a novel. If she had the strength and opportunity to save him in passing, she was willing to do so, but to bear the risk because of that and allow her friend to be rash, putting her life in danger, was definitely not something within her considerations. Zio nodded and said, "All right, we'll leave now." However, the person who left that comment definitely wouldn't be happy to see us do so. She will definitely hinder us. Let's do it this way. We'll escape in different directions and make that person choose one person. Whoever successfully leaves this area will immediately cause a commotion and attract the official Beyonders. Why don't we directly cause a commotion here? Furs subconsciously raised a question. It will definitely be stopped or foiled. Zio gave her excuse. Furs nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense. All right, let's not delay it any further. Let's begin. Zio didn't say another word as she took out her transparent, nearly invisible triangular blade. With her back bent, she leaped out of her hiding spot and ran out of the harbor amidst the shadows. The triangular blade was a mystical item she had spent 500 pounds through Mam Hermit to get the artisan to forge with the ancient wraith's powder and remnant spirituality. It was called Wintry Blade. Anyone hit by this weapon, even if it were a gentle touch, would be frozen stiff. They would even lose control of their thoughts as though they were possessed by a wraith. At the same time, once the battle continued, Wintry Blade's enemies would gradually have their thoughts turn sluggish and their actions become rigid and dull, even if they didn't touch the triangular blade. And Wintry Blade's negative effects wasn't that terrifying. Furthermore, there was only one. The wielder would slowly lose their body temperature and transform into an undead. Once a certain time limit was exceeded, this process would become irreversible. Therefore, Zio had recently enjoyed jogging more or riding a bicycle at lightning speeds to generate heat to resist the loss of temperature. But even so, she had only managed to extend the time it took before she kept Wintry Blade away from her body from 3 hours to 4 hours. After running a certain distance, Zio turned back and realized that Furs had already passed through a wall and departed. She had vanished from where they were hiding. After staring for 2 seconds, Zio bit her lip and suddenly turned around and changed direction. She headed straight for the warehouse. Soon, she arrived beside her destination, but she wasn't in a rush to enter. She looked up and observed the area above her, seemingly trying to find another passageway, one that was less noticeable to the people inside. At that moment, her keen senses made her turn her head and see a figure appear around the corner of the wall. The figure wore a black dress with a head of brown, curly hair. She had a pair of light blue eyes. It was none other than Furs Wall. Didn't you leave? Despite being surprised, Zio didn't forget to lower her voice. Furs curled her lips and said, "Weren't you fleeing too?" Zio was momentarily at a loss for words. After a few seconds, she asked, "How did you notice it? You didn't even mention Sherman. That's completely unlike you. I've already prepared a reason to persuade you." Furs quickly replied. Zio was taken aback as she said with a complicated expression, "You didn't have to come back." Furs ignored her and pressed on the wall of the warehouse and said, "If we keep talking, perhaps we will no longer need to be stumped because it would already be over." "Man, I actually didn't think of such a good idea just now. I should have immediately insisted on going with you to save her. You definitely would have persuaded me otherwise and would think of doing it yourself. If we repeated the conversation a few times, everything would have ended on its own." Zio gave her friend a look and, without any hesitation, stood by her side with Wintry Blade in hand. Furs immediately flipped Lamino's travels and augmented her friend with Beyonder powers. Then, she put away the spellbook and grabbed Zio's shoulder with one hand, pressing the other on the wall again. While Zio was waiting for door opening, she realized that Furs hadn't immediately used her powers. This best-selling author took a deep breath and quickly said, "After entering, we'll hide and observe. After confirming that there's a chance to do something, we'll take action. If there's really no chance, or if we can't seize an opportunity for sure, we'll leave as soon as possible. That way, we can at least avenge Sherman and not be buried alive with him. Only by being alive will all kinds of possibilities open up for us." Zio immediately nodded and replied in a stern manner, "Okay." Furs wanted to say a few more words, but considering how she had wasted some time and couldn't afford to waste any more time, she opened the illusory door and passed through the wall with Zio, coming behind a row of wooden crates. With her no longer being a greenhorn in such operations, she instinctively crouched down and pulled out Lamino's travels and flipped to a particular page. Zio similarly didn't dash in. She bent down and moved her eyes to a gap between the crates and observed the empty region. The female-looking Sherman was sitting on a wooden crate without any signs of anger. Her brown hair was gently fluttering in the wind. And standing in front of her was Viscount Stratford. This captain of the Royal Guards tightened his collar and was surveying the area, a mystery as to what he was looking for. Unfortunately, you're only a demoness. Don't worry. I will let you die without any pain. You will be completely purified. As he spoke, he took out an item from his inner pocket. Zio used her enhanced vision from the interrogator potion, and she clearly identified the item. It was a cross accessory covered in bronze. There were a few sharp, jagged protrusions, looking as though it had once impaled someone. Its style and characteristics were things that the various nations in the Fifth Epoch's northern continent didn't possess. It exuded ancient vibes. Very good. You know that resistance is futile, Viscount Stratford said as he pressed one of the fingers he used to hold the bronze cross onto the spike. His bright red blood immediately flowed out and was absorbed by the spike, seeping into the object. The mottled bronze on the cross's surface disintegrated, revealing a corporeal form beneath that was a blob of light. In just a second or two, the item Viscount Stratford held had turned into a resplendent cross. It emitted a pure and flawless glow, illuminating the surroundings in an abnormally bright manner. The wooden crate's shadows quickly receded as the dark splotches on the wall evaporated like water. Beside Charmaine, the countless spider webs that originally belonged to Trissy floated up and struggled in the fire, melting in just mere seconds. The light grew brighter, but they weren't blinding. Black flames burst out of Charmaine's body along with crystalline ice. They turned dim, transparent, and eventually vanished under the illumination. Within the range of the resplendent cross, there weren't any traces of evil or abnormalities present. Not 1 inch of darkness remained. Seeing Sherman's expression slowly distort, Zio couldn't help but shoot Furs a glance. She could clearly sense the terror of the resplendent cross, and she was beginning to waver about saving her. Furs also noticed what was happening and pointed to Lamino's travels. She raised her left index finger and whispered into Zio's ear, "There's only one chance. I will work hard to create it for you. If it's not successful or if you can't be certain of it, we will give up." Zio didn't hesitate as she nodded solemnly. Furs immediately straightened her body and flipped Lamino's travels to the charred yellow page. This page was filled with complicated, twisted, indescribable symbols and labels. It gave one the feeling of a strong gust of wind. Sailor Pathway's demigod power, hurricane. After observing her surroundings once again and confirming that there weren't any other enemies, Furs's gaze penetrated through the gap in between the wooden crates and locked onto Viscount Stratford. She then slid her finger gently across the charred yellow page. With an exploding whoosh, a visible hurricane soared up beneath Viscount Stratford's feet and rushed upwards. The captain of the Royal Guards wasn't able to maintain his balance from this sudden attack. He was lifted up by the hurricane and was slammed into the warehouse's ceiling. Boom! The warehouse's ceiling was torn apart by the hurricane as portions of it collapsed. Some of the fragments spun around amidst the wind as they flew higher and higher. Viscount Stratford nearly fainted from being slammed, and he failed to hold onto the resplendent cross, allowing it to fly out of his palm. When the spike with a sliver of his blood left his finger, the mottled bronze covered the cross's surface once more. The flawless light vanished in turn. Upon seeing this, Zio didn't hesitate to rush out of her hiding spot. Her eyes first reflected Viscount Stratford's figure before 2 blinding bolts of lightning lit up. Psychic piercing. 1022 answer. Amidst the violent hurricane, Viscount Stratford was like a helpless leaf that was pitifully thrown about as though he could be torn to pieces at any moment. In this state, he couldn't react at all, much less speak. All he could do was rely on a disciplinary paladin's powerful body to barely hold on, hoping that he wouldn't lose a limb or head inside this terrifying hurricane. He originally believed that the hunt had succeeded and that Trissy's capture was at hand. Furthermore, he was extremely certain that his target didn't have helpers. Hence, all his attention was focused on Charmaine. To his surprise, he suddenly became the prey and fell into a trap without any prior warning. Upon realizing that the hurricane was beginning to weaken and that he had only suffered some damage from the impact and didn't receive any fatal wounds, Viscount Stratford hurriedly tried to regain control of his body in preparation for the upcoming battle. At that moment, he felt a stabbing pain in his head which felt as though a sharp dagger had been impaled into it before being twisted a few times. This feeling was something that Viscount Stratford felt was both familiar and unfamiliar. This was because, although he had never experienced it directly before, he had attempted it on several targets to observe their reactions. This was one of the Beyonder powers he was most proficient with. Psychic piercing. Bang. Upon being attacked, Viscount Stratford, who had failed to adjust his physical state, slammed into the ground hard as the bronze cross loudly fell several meters away. Zio held Wintry blade and took a huge stride, dashing straight for Viscount Stratford, who was struggling to get up. As for Furs, she had already flipped through Lamino's travels and flipped it open to a page that resembled a goatskin parchment. As her fingers slid across the page, Viscount Stratford's shadows, which had surfaced once again, came to life, condensing into black chains that wrapped around its target, binding him tightly. Viscount Stratford, who had just managed to catch his breath and become alert, still hadn't had the opportunity to choose the target for his punishment and apply certain restrictions when he once again lost his freedom. Even his mouth was bound by a shadow chain. Abyss chains. It was abyss chains from the Sanguine or Moon Pathways mid-sequence Beyonders. Furs had used it once and was rather fond of this Beyonder power. She found it very useful, so she had spent gold pounds to get Mr. Moon, who had become a Viscount, to record it. Bang. At this moment, Viscount Stratford suddenly unleashed power that surpassed his previous strength, tearing the shadow chains apart. He had chosen the bindings, restricting him to be the target of punishment. But at that moment, Zio had already rushed in front of him like a high-speed train, thrusting that transparent triangular blade. Amidst a splotching sound, the wintry blade stabbed into the target's abdomen. Viscount Stratford's body stiffened once again as his eyes glazed over as though he had turned into an ice sculpture. Zio released her hand and allowed Wintry blade to remain stabbed into the stomach of the captain of the Royal Guards, seemingly hoping that the wraith which might have existed on the weapon would continue possessing her target and forcibly bring him under control. Right on the heels of that, she swung her arm and slammed a punch right below Viscount Stratford's ear. After 2 heavy blows, Viscount Stratford fainted without even letting out a grunt. His stiff body collapsed once again. After completing the strike, Zio left her back to Furs and immediately moved past the staggering Viscount Stratford, who had Wintry blade in his stomach, and dashed to Sherman, who remained sitting on a wooden crate. Furs flipped through Lamino's travels once again, using other Beyonder powers to add another layer of restrictions onto Viscount Stratford's body. Then, she walked out of the row of wooden crates she had been hiding behind and first approached that bronze ancient cross. The scene she saw made her suspect that it was an item at the demigod level. In the parlance of official Beyonders, it was a Grade 1 sealed artifact. And with Viscount Stratford carrying and using it, she believed that the negative effects of the cross weren't that direct. She could attempt to pick it up. Of course, as a former astrologer, Furs took out the pure crystal ball as she walked, quickly doing a divination. There are no problems. Furs glanced at the outcome and quickened her pace. At this moment, Zio had already rushed in front of Sherman. Looking at this friend who had turned rather beautiful, she was momentarily at a loss for words. To her, Sherman's condition was in a terrible state. This demoness hair was floating up with each strand turning thick as if they were tiny snakes. On the ends of the tiny snakes, some had eyes or mouths. They appeared extremely bizarre and terrifying. On Sherman's face, a black paint-like mysterious pattern suffused out of her skin and was rapidly spreading across her body. Her slightly vacant eyes quickly reflected Zio as she gradually recovered her spirit, and, along with that, also came a little confusion and pain. She opened her mouth and stuttered, "Zio? I'm in so much pain." Zio's vision instantly blurred. Although she was still lacking in many of the details regarding the mysterious world's general knowledge, since the Tarot Club's discussion was just way over her head, and the information she got from MI9 was mostly about secret organizations, she still knew quite a bit about losing control. Among unaffiliated Beyonders, it was something that couldn't be avoided. Therefore, Zio knew that Sherman was beginning to lose control. It was irreversible, and the situation would only worsen. Sherman seemed to sense her state as she gasped for breath, revealing a weak smile. She said with difficulty, Kill me. I've done too many unspeakable sins. I've also obtained what I've wanted. Zio's tears dripped down. Without hesitation, she flipped her hand, drawing her backup weapon, an ordinary revolver. She then placed the revolver at Sherman's forehead. Sherman smiled as a mesmerizing charm appeared in her eyes once again. Call me Sherman. Sherman? Zio couldn't help but frown as tears brimmed in her eyes. Bang, bang, bang. She repeatedly pulled the trigger and fired the bullets inside. Fresh flowers bloomed at once, red and beautiful. Furs pursed her lips unknowingly when she saw this. After 2 seconds, she let out a long sigh. She bent down and reached out for the bronze cross. Just as her fingers touched the item, it felt like she had touched fire. It was hot and scalding, hot enough to burn the soul. Furs instinctively retracted her hand, feeling alarmed and puzzled. She remembered that Viscount Stratford had never acted in such a manner before. As her thoughts raced, Furs glanced at Viscount Stratford and kicked the bronze cross towards the nearby Zio. Give it a try. Also, we have to leave immediately. The commotion from earlier will definitely attract the official Beyonders. Also, who knows what the person who left the message will do. Zio, with her reddened eyes, didn't say a word. She bent down and picked up the bronze cross. She didn't feel any sense of discomfort the entire time. Furs didn't ask why as she walked to the stiff Viscount Stratford's body and warily looked around. After Zio put away the bronze cross, she picked up Sherman's corpse and returned to Viscount Stratford's side. That item is very precious. His status is also very important. We'll definitely be the targets of the royal family's pursuit efforts. We need to do some interference. Furs looked down at Viscount Stratford as she muttered to herself in thought. She quickly made a decision. She raised her hands, lowered her head, and began piously chanting Mr. Fool's honorific name. She didn't believe that them giving up the bronze cross would stop the royal family from pursuing them due to being perceived to have lower priority. Therefore, without any hesitation, she prayed to Mr. Fool for help. To her, sacrificing the item to Mr. Fool was better than staying there. Almost at the same time, she saw a holy angel with 12 pairs of fiery wings. A phantom projected out of the angel as it descended from the sky, wrapping her and Zio in layers of flaming wings. Once this was over, Furs was just about to say something when she felt her body quiver. She felt a particular sense of horror and evil permeate from the void. Her eyes focused as she didn't hesitate to crouch down, reaching out her hands and grabbing Zio and Viscount Stratford's calf. At the same time, the final dark green stone with burn marks on her bracelet emitted a blue and illusory light. In the blink of an eye, the bodies of Furs, Zio, Viscount Stratford, and Sherman turned transparent as they vanished from the spot. In seconds, they left the docks area and appeared on the outskirts of St. George Borough. During this process, Furs had even used her Beyonder power as a scribe to record him traveling. After observing her surroundings and confirming that there was no one around since they were in the forests, Furs released Zio and Viscount Stratford and straightened her body. With the blessings of Mr. Fool's angel, there shouldn't be much danger. The person who left the message won't be able to lock onto us. Furs heaved a sigh of relief before saying with a lingering sense of fear, the person who descended upon us towards the end was definitely a saint. Thankfully, we quickly escaped. Zio gently lowered Sherman's corpse and said in thought, if the person who left the message was monitoring Sherman, then she might have already found out where we live. We can't return there. Yes, we need to change our residence, Furs said with great experience. Then she cast her gaze at the unconscious Viscount Stratford. You can interrogate him now. Make every second count. As she spoke, she handed Lamino's Travels to Zio and exhorted, there's telepathy on it and it's used with candlelight. Also, start with the simple and unimportant questions to lower his resistance. Zio received the spellbook with a solemn expression. However, her wrist trembled, unable to hold Lamino's Travels. But the bronze notebook dropped onto the ground as Zio said with a frown, it's like fire. Furs had the same experience earlier, so after some thought, she said, throw that cross away and try again. Zio followed her suggestion and successfully picked up Lamino's Travels. It cannot be held with other mystical items, Furs said with a nod when she saw this. Zio didn't harp on this problem as she quickly prepared a lit candle. Then, she drew Wintry Blade and relieved Viscount Stratford from his stiff and dazed state. After the captain of the Royal Guards gradually awakened, she triggered the corresponding page in the notebook. Viscount Stratford instantly fell into confusion, and only the faint candlelight remained in his eyes. Why did Charmaine try to approach you? Zio asked the question she had just thought of. Viscount Stratford replied blankly, she was investigating who I'm loyal to. Zio was taken aback as she instinctively asked, who are you really loyal to? Viscount Stratford slowly said, His Majesty, of course. Chapter 1023 Mason Dear's Death His Majesty. Zio was a little confused and filled with confusion when she heard Viscount Stratford's reply. She found it inexplicable that Charmaine would deliberately approach this captain of the Royal Guards just to investigate where his loyalties lay. This didn't seem to be something of great importance or value. As for Viscount Stratford's answer, it was very normal and without any faults. Charmaine paid with her life for such an answer? Zio originally wished to press for the reason behind Charmaine's investigation of such a trivial matter, but she immediately realized that it might involve key intel too soon. It might cause Viscount Stratford, who hadn't entered the necessary state, to put up resistance. So she gradually held back her instinctive urge. She thought for a moment and asked, Do you know Mason Dear? Yes, Viscount Stratford answered blankly. Zio Dericha continued asking rather simple and unimportant questions. Who is he? He's the former captain of the Royal Guards, Viscount Stratford answered simply without elaborating. At this moment, Furs didn't listen to the telepathy at such a superficial layer. She took out the pure crystal ball and placed it in Zio's pocket. After transferring her items, she bent down once again and carefully attempted to pick up the bronze cross. This time, amidst her trembling fingers, the soul-burning feeling didn't assault her. It allowed her to easily pick up the spiky item. As expected, this cross cannot coexist with other mystical items. I still have Moon Paper figurine and the remnant spirituality of the ancient wraiths, but it didn't react. This means that it can coexist with items that don't contain Beyonder characteristics, but won't resist spirituality and strength? If that's the case, will it also reject the Beyonder characteristic within my body? But it doesn't seem obvious. This is its other negative side effect, and it requires some time before it shows signs. Furs had a general idea about this ancient bronze cross. She then warily stored it away in a bag that contained all kinds of ritual materials. After doing this, Furs looked down at the silver bracelet on her wrist. She confirmed that it was completely empty and was without any accessories hanging from it. She had used up all 5 stones that allowed her to use teleport. However, Furs no longer felt as anxious as before. Although she believed that the full moon ravings would become clearer and more terrifying with the usage of each stone, she also knew that with Mr. Fool's help, this wasn't a problem. Over the past year, if not for her need to spend some time above the gray fog during every full moon or blood moon, she would have almost forgotten that she was suffering the torment from the full moon ravings. I hope that the curse will be lifted one day. After retracting her gaze from the dull silver bracelet, Furs couldn't help but sigh. She then sincerely thanked Mr. Fool in her heart. No matter what his real goal is, he has rescued me time and time again. It hasn't only been from the full moon ravings. This cross's level doesn't seem low. I wonder if Mr. Fool will be interested and is willing to accept my sacrifice. I didn't have any good items or news to repay him for his benevolence. I finally see an opportunity. This is a common spoil of war. I only own half of it. I wonder if Mr. Fool is willing to accept a sacrifice that I only have half the rights to. No, Zio has also been rescued by Mr. Fool before. Perhaps it might please Mr. Fool? He is satisfied he might produce a few Beyonder powers and allow me to record them in Laymanos Travels. No, Laymanos Travels might not be able to record a deity's powers. It won't be able to withstand Mr. Fool's powers. The powers of the angels under him will do too. No, I can't be too greedy. I'll be satisfied if Mr. World can demonstrate some of his powers for me to record. Furza's thoughts wandered as she had expectations akin to a dream. This was the instinct of a best-selling author. As for why she didn't expect anything else other than the recording of Beyond Her Powers, it was because she realized today how important and terrifying Beyond Her Powers at the demigod level were. If Lamino's travels didn't have Hurricane recorded, she and Zio might not have been able to capture Viscount Stratford. They might not even succeed in escaping. Even if she didn't include the Bronze Cross, Viscount Stratford himself was a rather powerful Beyonder. If he hadn't been injured by Hurricane in the beginning and left dizzy from the fall, their sneak attacks might not have reached this level of success. There was a high chance that they might suffer a counterattack. Of course, separating the resplendent cross from Viscount Stratford was key to the victory of this brief battle tonight. And again, this was all thanks to Hurricane. On careful thought, if we switch to a less pressing situation, and if the Bronze Cross and the demigod powers in the notebook were excluded, Zio and I might have a chance of defeating Viscount Stratford together. We might even have quite good odds. The Beyonder powers recorded in the notebook are varied, and when put together, they're truly powerful. Together with Zio's psychic piercing and the effects of Wintry Blade, in a head-on battle, it's reasonable for Viscount Stratford to be defeated if he doesn't have any special mystical items. A living scribe with rich experience is actually this powerful. The more Furs thought, the stranger she felt. She realized that she had become rather formidable. Back when they were dealing with the ancient Wraith, she had already come to a similar conclusion. And this time, their enemy, Viscount Stratford, was the captain of the royal guards of the lone royal family. He was at least sequence 6 and was probably sequence 5. Furthermore, he wielded an item at the demigod level. The level of his strength was clear, so this immediately allowed Furs to benchmark her level in the world of Beyonders. Although their victory mainly stemmed from a sneak attack, a successful one was also a manifestation of one's strength. I'm already a scribe. With a good combination of powers, together with Lamino's travels, I'm already a rather strong sequence 5. The only problem is that I lack experience. As Furs reflected poignantly, she cast her gaze at Zio and Viscount Stratford, continuing to listen to their questions and answers. At this moment, Zio's question had already reached a rather key topic that could easily result in resistance. How did Mason Deer die? After asking this question, Zio's expressions suddenly turned complicated and expectant. She was also in a dilemma, feeling pangs of excitement and fear. This was a question she wished to ask 8 years ago. In these nearly 3,000 days, she had been constantly searching for an answer, but she was also afraid that the answer wasn't something she expected. She was afraid that her father was really involved in a mutiny and thus was executed, marring his reputation. Viscount Stratford didn't immediately answer Zio's question. He seemed to struggle before saying, he discovered His Majesty's secret and tried informing the 3 churches but failed. He was executed on the spot. Zio fell into a daze for a few seconds before finally confirming the answer she received. Although this answer shocked her, it made the heart in her mouth sink back to its original position as she calmed down. Secret. His Majesty's secret, she muttered softly to herself and asked in a pressing tone, what secret? Furs, who was beside her, was also shocked to the point of being dumbfounded. She never expected things to develop to this stage. At that moment, Viscount Stratford's facial muscles visibly contorted. It took him a great deal of effort to say a few words. That secret is... Suddenly, his body jerked violently. His confused eyes regained their luster. Right on the heels of that, his body collapsed from the most minute part, instantly transforming into a ball of fireworks. The blood-red fireworks soared into the sky and exploded, illuminating the night sky as they were reflected in Furza's and Zio's eyes. Having experienced this previously, Furs didn't waste any time after her eyes momentarily blanked out. She immediately crouched down and grabbed Shermane's corpse and Zio's calf. Their figures swiftly turned transparent as they vanished from the spot, teleporting to the southern area of the bridge. Above the gray fog, Klein, who was holding the sea god scepter, saw the fireworks that stained the sky red. Back when Furs prayed to him, he had happened to be inside the magnificent palace observing Kona's Kilgore's actions. He conveniently took in the red priest card and used the paper figurine he cut, stirred the powers of the mysterious space, and gave a response. During this process, he discovered that the person lying next to Miss Magician and Miss Judgment was Viscount Stratford. This was one of the targets he had placed great importance on. Although he hadn't investigated him personally, he knew that there was something wrong with him. He knew that Demonis Trissy was targeting him, so he had remembered his appearance and characteristics at a ball. Klein didn't know what the two Tarot Club members were up to, but since it involved Viscount Stratford, he definitely didn't write off its importance. He directly observed what subsequently happened to Miss Magician and Miss Judgment through the Crimson Stars. After advancing to a demigod and obtaining even more authorities, he didn't need the Tarot Club members to pray to directly observe their vicinity via the Crimson Star. This was similar to specially marking out believers, but Klein had always held great restraint towards that and had never attempted it. This made him hear Zio's and Viscount Stratford's conversation. And since he knew the underlying truth, he knew very well what the true meaning and importance of who he was loyal to was. Combined with the discovery of the king's secret by the former captain of the Royal Guards, Mason Deer, and how his attempt to inform the three churches failed, Klein already had a guess. He suspected that the greatest culprit behind the Great Smog of Backland was the Lone Kingdom's king, George III. 1024 Traditional skills inside the palace above the gray fog. Klein, who was holding the sea god scepter, looked at the Black Emperor card and the Tyrant card on the table in front of him with a heavy look. Although Viscount Stratford's answer could only prove that King George III hid a great secret, had played a crucial role in the Great Smog of Backland, and was highly likely to be a mass murderer, it couldn't be said that he had spearheaded everything and was the true mastermind. After all, he might only be a puppet. But to Klein, this was already enough. The target was clear, and he had clues to investigate what they were planning. Seeing that Miss Magician and Miss Judgment had left the area where the abnormality had happened and were practically safe, Klein retracted his gaze and continued to observe the actions of MI9 Deputy Director, Kona's Kilgore, via prayer vision. After a while, after securing the territory and confirming that no one was tailing him, Kona's Kilgore walked to a mountain wall and took out an object. His entire body was tainted with a ghostly blue glow as he gradually became hazy and blurry. Then he disappeared into thin air, his whereabouts unknown. A rather special form of traveling via a corporeal ritual or item that allows him to teleport from point to point within a very short distance. Back when I came out from the underground ruins where Nsangwil was, I also passed through a similar door. Yes, this place isn't too far from the mountain where Mr. A pursued me. This setup needs a very suitable and secretive region. Without having any permission from the interior, just holding on to an activation item might not have any effect. And once something happens, destroying the corresponding ritual can prevent enemies from entering and stop them from finding the exact location. Klein nodded in enlightenment. Combining the information which Viscount Stratford had just revealed, he had come to the initial conclusion that the king's secret and the ploy by the three factions were all hidden deep within the underground ruins. As long as one entered, the truth would be obtained through a careful investigation. However, the difficulty in performing the investigations became apparent the more he thought about it. He had to first obtain the corresponding item and, using his disguise as a faceless to fool the guards, he would teleport in. None of these steps were easy. According to Rhodes, Kona's Kilgore wasn't just a demigod of the Black Emperor pathway, he also possessed a rather powerful sealed artifact. Even if Klein had made preparations, his odds of defeating the Brigadier General of MI9 wasn't too high if he didn't seek the help of angels, much less finish him off in a stealthy manner without anyone realizing it. Furthermore, there were many difficulties in getting the help of an angel, as all of them had their own extenuating circumstances that prevented them from agreeing. Even if I take down Kona's Kilgore without drawing the attention of anyone, I have to consider the danger that stems from entering. Based on what previously happened, it's impossible for them to not be on guard against a faceless, cooperation effort between the king, the psychology alchemists, and the demonist sect guarantees that their ploy is significant. It's extremely possible that there's an angel within the underground ruins. Klein frowned as he was at a loss for a reliable angle for investigation. He tapped the edge of the long mottled table and decided to break out of the confines of his original thoughts and consider it from a different angle. A few seconds later, a flash of inspiration came to him. Why do I want to complete all these steps by myself? The king's secret and plans are likely detrimental to the three churches of Storm, Evernight, and Steam. Otherwise, the former captain of the Royal Guards, Mason Deer, wouldn't have attempted to inform the three churches. As a blessed of the Evernight goddess, at least for now, isn't it obvious what I should be doing? This can also count towards my contributions to exchange for the scholar of your potion formula. In an instant, Klein's thoughts became extremely clear. He left the area above the gray fog without any hesitation and returned to the real world. Dressed in blue and white checkered pajamas, Gehrman Sparrow raised his hands once more and made a prayer gesture. He chanted in ancient Hermes, the Evernight goddess who stands higher than the cosmos and more eternal than eternity. You are also the Lady of Crimson, the Mother of Concealment, the Empress of Misfortune and Horror, Mistress of Repose and Silence. This time, Klein didn't hold a ritual because he wasn't praying for a bestowment or response. All he wanted was to simply describe what Viscount Stratford had said, as well as his observations regarding Kona's Kilgore. Therefore, a direct prayer was sufficient. After praying, Klein exhaled and stood in a remote area of the woods, patiently awaiting the possible developments. In less than a minute, a figure suddenly appeared in front of him, like a quickly sketched portrait. The newcomer was dressed in a simple robe. By the figure's waist was a belt made of tree bark. Long hair cascaded down as the figure was barefoot. She had a pair of dark and serene eyes, and she was none other than the highest-ranking archbishop and leader of the ascetics, servant of concealment, Ariana. Good evening, Ma'am Ariana, Klein bowed without any hint of surprise. Ariana glanced at him and returned the greeting. Good evening. She didn't make any small talk as she directly asked, Kona's Kilgore is nearby? Yes, less than 10 kilometers away. Klein pointed in the direction. He has already used an item to vanish from his place. What should we do next? Ariana nodded slightly and said, wait for him to come out and find an opportunity to capture him. Isn't that too direct? You look quiet and plain, a cultured person. No, Angel. Why are you so aggressive? If Kona's Kilgore didn't head for the underground ruins and had gone to some other secret base, or if he wasn't too deeply involved in the king's ploys, to have the church's archbishop taking action on MI9's top brass would definitely be breaking news. The kingdom's fracturing would only worsen. Klein was momentarily unsure how he should respond to Ariana. Although he would definitely attack Kona's Kilgore if he handled the matter himself, since the latter's involvement in the slave trade and the silencing of others was enough reason, the problem was that a demigod of a secret organization attacking a military top brass and an Orthodox church's archbishop attacking a military top brass was two completely different matters. As though sensing Klein's thoughts, Ariana calmly explained, you will be the one taking action, not me. Klein was a little unused to her style. Ariana continued, I will create a concealed world for you and provide you the necessary assistance. Battle in a concealed state? Fight with the help of an angel? Klein nodded with a thought. Then where shall the ambush be? Ariana answered succinctly, in your mager manner. I share the same thoughts. But I didn't want to say it myself. Klein took a deep breath and exhaled. The choice for the ambush location stemmed from very simple logic. It was to do it when Kona's Kilgore was in his most relaxed and defenseless state. Without a doubt, once Kona's finishes his secret mission and returns to Mager Manor, he would believe that the most risky matters of the night were over. He wouldn't have his guard up. For the same reason, if the king's secret and ploy was of utmost importance, it was possible for an angel to be watching over him while he returned from the underground ruins. Once he suffered an attack, the angel would be able to immediately respond. And only when Kona's returned to his normal daily routine would the monitoring be retracted. After all, there were only a limited number of angels, so it was impossible for them to be so free. Thankfully, I used the most covert method of tailing him, and the distance was far enough. From the looks of it, Ma'am Ariana didn't place the responsibility of the battle onto me to avoid the risk and reduce the negative effects, but because maintaining a concealed state and preventing the existence inside the underground mints from noticing the battle will drain a great deal of her energy. Amidst his racing thoughts, Klein had a better idea of how he should proceed. At this moment, Ariana added, "The concealed world's battle won't damage the real world." "That's pretty good," Klein muttered silently and said after some thought, "Then I need to immediately make some preparations." "All right," Ariana calmly replied. She didn't even ask me what preparations I need. I was even prepared to say that I need a change of clothes. As Klein lampooned himself, he looked down at his blue and white checkered pajamas. His left palm quickly turned transparent as he vanished from the spot. Inside Mager Manor, Klein's figure blinked into existence. Maintaining his appearance as Gehrman Sparrow, he quickly changed his clothes and wore a top hat. Following that, he took out a piece of paper and used his finger to write. The tip of his finger spewed out a scarlet flame, leaving charred marks without burning the piece of paper. The charred marks quickly formed a complicated symbol that was a mixture of concealment and mystery prying. With the formation of this symbol, the full-body mirror in the room turned dark as aqueous light rippled. A silver outline appeared, forming one word after another. "Exalted Great Master, your loyal and resilient servant, Rhodes, is here to answer your summoning. Do you have something you would like to ask me?" Klein nodded and looked out the window. "What demigod powers and powerful sealed artifacts does Kona's Kilgore have?" This was something he vaguely knew before. After confirming that Kona's Kilgore was a target, he gathered more information and now wished to know more so as to prepare a strategy meant to target Kona's. The full-body mirror's silver words warped and squirmed, quickly forming new words. "Great Master, Kona's Kilgore is an Earl of the Fallen. To hide his strength, he wields a sealed artifact that also belongs to the lawyer pathway. However, it also has some of the arbiter pathway's characteristics mixed into it. It's called Chapter 1025 Random Anomalies. The full-body mirror's silver words seemed to have a life of their own as they vanished and reformed. The Concerto of Light and Shadow is a pocket watch. It can restrict certain actions in a particular area, and it can also strip certain beyonder powers from the target. When the two are put together, the limitations that are created far exceed the two types. The Concerto of Light and Shadow is also able to gift certain negative side effects to the target, making him sluggish, eager, avaricious, or lose their fighting spirit, only capable of focusing his attention on money. Apart from these effects, the sealed artifact's wielder would have the ability to distort the target's speech, actions, intentions, and attacks. It can reduce a lethal blow into a serious injury, or it could repel an attack, turning progression into retrogression, escaping into leading a charge. The negative effects of Concerto of Light and Shadow are rather serious. Amongst them, the main negative effect to take note of is that once it's brought into combat, all the beyonder effects produced in a certain region would intermittently experience random anomalies. It wouldn't distinguish between friend or foe, making it hard to control and unpredictable. That also means that lightning strike might still create a bolt of lightning, but it might splash the target with a blast of cold water or summon unknown spirit world creatures. Due to this reason, Kona's Kilgore has deliberately sought out a mystical item that can make him sufficiently lucky at critical moments, hoping that the random intermittent effects will benefit himself. It's definitely useful to a certain extent, but it's not that great. Kona's Kilgore also has a strange revolver. It originated from an anomaly during an evil god's sacrifice. It's called Rever's Shout of Despair. It can shoot without bullets, and each shot possesses immense strength. It can shoot at a rapid pace like a miniature machine gun. Targets who are hit by it will suffer Rever's Shout of Despair before he died. They will suffer different levels of pain, dizziness, and confusion. The biggest problem with the revolver is that the wielder will also hear the shout of despair. It just won't be too frequent. As an Earl of the Fallen, Kona's Kilgore no doubt has a qualitative change when it comes to distortion and the unreasonable bestowment. In addition, he can also exploit laws and magnify effects and use disorder to disrupt order. Exploit can extend certain states for longer periods of time or end it ahead of time. It will make the rules more beneficial to himself. For example, after jumping into midair, the state of being away from the ground can be extended, achieving the effect of floating. Magnify can boost the effects or influence of his actions. It can make an ordinary attack become an execution. It can turn a hug from a distance away into a restriction. Disorder will influence the structure of objects, the standards of measurement, and the accuracy of attacks. It will make a seemingly massive building collapse, causing what seems like a huge distance to be shortened to that of a few paces, as well as allowing attacks that are aimed at him to miss their mark. Through magnify, exploit, and distortion, Beyonders of the lawyer pathway can achieve certain things that only Beyonders of the arbiter pathway can accomplish. Of course, low and mid-sequence Beyonder powers of the lawyer pathway like bribe are equally possessed by an Earl of the Fallen and are even stronger. Great Master, I've finished answering your question. Is that okay? Your answer is like a guidebook. You must have been gathering information from the spirit world while delivering it. Also, must you seek praise even for matters such as this? Klein lampooned and nodded slightly. That's right. After answering Rhodes's question, he quickly got into the zone as he analyzed the powers and traits of the powerful sealed artifact which the demigod, Kona's Kilgore, had. An Earl of the Fallen is indeed a sequence for demigod existence. There are qualitative changes in various aspects, be it bestowment, distortion, exploit, and magnify. None of them are easy to deal with. I might suffer if I'm careless. Rather, disorder isn't terrifying. It's basically an enhanced version of the sequence 5 Mentor of Confusion's power. The Concerto of Light and Shadow does have traits of the arbiter domain. And the most frustrating aspect about it is the negative side effects. To a Beyonder of the Seer pathway, my combat style is definitely closer to one of preparation, precision, and control. Once the battle begins, the moves will chain one after another. During this process, if a random deviation were to happen, the entire plan can easily be messed up and not be accomplished. It's very dangerous. As he thought, Klein discovered that the main problem stemmed from the sealed artifact named Concerto of Light and Shadow. As a Beyonder who liked setting up traps for his enemy, Klein didn't wish that after throwing himself into a perilous situation through his painstaking planning and hard work, he would realize that the item would summon a rabbit just as he was using the Fate Siphon charm to switch fates with his target to turn the tables and finish off his opponent. Or perhaps it would turn into fireworks to celebrate the death of the user. Kona's Kilgore can reduce the effects by raising his luck, but I can't do it. Fortune or misfortune that's not at the angel level won't be effective on me. However, I have the marionette, winner and unit. Klein thought as he gave Rhodes the second question. How can the intermittent random anomalies of that sealed artifact be avoided? Silver words appeared out of the ripples of the deep mirror, forming a new sentence. There's no need to avoid it. Kona's Kilgore just needs to become unlucky, and for this, the demigods of the Evernight pathway are experts. Makes sense? According to the theory of relativity, as long as Kona's Kilgore is more unlucky than me, I'll be the lucky one. Ma'am Ariana said that she can provide me with assistance. To her, secretly slipping some misfortune onto Kona's Kilgore before creating the concealed state should be very simple and easy. Klein immediately nodded cheerfully. Very good. That's it for today. I'll summon you again if there's anything else. Yes, Master. No problem, Master. Goodbye. Master Dash on the full-body mirror's surface was a simple drawing followed by silver words. Seeing the mirror instantly return to normal, Klein retracted his gaze and quickly simulated the battle that would happen in his mind. Gradually, he came up with an idea, and grabbing onto that flash of inspiration, he proceeded forward in refining it. After having a few tentative plans, Klein walked to the balcony and looked at the garden in the night sky, whispering, "Can you inflict misfortune onto Kona's Kilgore before the battle?" After a brief silence, a calm and ordinary female voice rang in his ears. Yes. Then it's fine on my side, Klein immediately replied. Tranquility quickly returned to his surroundings. A rather cold breeze blew by, and Klein expressionlessly stared at the manor for a few seconds. Then he pressed down on his silk hat, pulled the human-skinned glove on his left hand, and drew Death Knell from his underarm holster. Right on the heels of that, he flicked his thumb and made the iron-black revolver's cylinder spin. The night grew darker as the crimson moon occasionally tore through the clouds. Mager Manor was completely in a state of deep sleep. At this moment, a figure stealthily came from the Tussock River's south bank, taking 2 to 3 steps to return to his room. He was none other than the deputy director of MI9, Konas Kilgore, who wore a white shirt and black trousers. This demigod with a stout look surveyed the area and didn't notice any abnormalities. He gradually revealed a smile and walked to the bar counter in the guest room. Getting a cup, he picked up a bottle of Mager red wine. He prepared to pour some for himself to celebrate the wonderful night. At this moment, his spiritual perception was triggered as he looked up abruptly. He saw the buildings with a few grayish-white chimneys suddenly become covered in shadows as if they were dyed with ink. To the side of the chimneys, on one of the steeple landmarks of Mager Manor's main building, it was equally dark. The bright red moon was silently hanging behind the chimney. The clouds and stars high in the sky had vanished. Apart from the gigantic crimson moon, there was pitch-black darkness. Under the night sky, the flowers and trees were clearly in front of him, but they lacked any signs of life. They were dim, as though they were a great distance away. Black and red, shadows and buildings, and the silence and plants presented themselves in front of Konas Kilgore in such a strange state. The demigod's pupils dilated as he didn't hesitate to respond. He reached his left hand into his clothes and extended his right hand under his armpit, taking out 2 items. Amongst them, he held a strange revolver in his right palm. It was entirely gray in color, bigger than an ordinary revolver. It looked like it was half the size of a sledgehammer that was used in classical battles. Another unusual trait of the revolver was that it had 6 barrels, each rather thick. The mouth was dark, and its cylinder was embedded with more than 10 ugly rivets, making it have a rather crude beauty. Konas Kilgore's left hand held an iron-skinned pocket watch. On the watch's face, half of it was filled with neatly arranged symbols that followed the order of time, while the other half was a chaotic mess. It even intruded into the neighboring region. On both sides, it seemed impossible to see the machinery behind them as they formed into a structure that looked even more complex and headache-inducing. Almost at the same time, a figure emerged out of the gigantic crimson moon. It glided over at an extremely fast speed. He grew bigger and clearer. He was a young man with black hair, brown eyes, and cut features. The young man was wearing a silk top hat and a black trench coat. He held a unique revolver in one hand and a transparent human-skinned glove covering the other. Under the bright illumination of the surroundings, he seemed to be burdened with the weight of the gigantic crimson moon. Gehrman Sparrow. Meow had an only slightly assisted fight against a sequence 4, where planning might go awry. I am looking forward to seeing how he will pull this off. Chapter 10:26 2 Restrictions. Upon seeing the young man in the black trench coat appear with a black revolver in hand, Konas Kilgore, who was no stranger to all the important figures in the world, immediately responded. The thumb on his left hand that held the iron-skinned pocket watch was rapidly moving, reaching for one of the metal buttons on the messy inlays of the pocket watch. He suddenly raised his right arm, aiming at Gehrman Sparrow with the 6 gray gun barrels that formed a circle. This process was like a fleeting spark that quickly came to an end. As for Konas Kilgore's left thumb, it had pressed down. He overcame his instinct and didn't directly use restriction from the concerto of light and shadow. This was because he didn't know Gehrman Sparrow well enough, unsure as to what he was best at. Furthermore, the person with Gehrman Sparrow's appearance might not be Gehrman Sparrow. Blindly using restriction would only be a waste of an opportunity. He intended to observe and wait for a while longer before he came up with a more specific order to distort the laws. Bang, 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 bang. Bang. The strange revolver let out a roar of despair and spewed out a storm of black and icy bullets, instantly enveloping the enemy beneath the crimson moon. At this moment, Gairman Sparrow's figure turned transparent and incorporeal. At the same time, the bullets tore through the target in the black trench coat, tearing apart the afterimage he left behind. And behind Kona's Kilgore, Gairman Sparrow, with a cold expression, quickly appeared. His body was half-crouched and he was leaning forward. The black top hat on his head appeared blood-red under the crimson moon's illumination. He suddenly raised the black-barreled revolver in his hand, opening his mouth slightly while aiming and squeezing the trigger. Bang! The floorboard to the right of Kona's Kilgore exploded into countless fragments. Gairman Sparrow's shot had been ridiculously far off the mark. Furthermore, its destructive power was clearly lacking. This was the distortion power of an Earl of the Fallen. It caused the bullet's trajectory to deviate and have its power weakened. Seizing this opportunity, Kona's Kilgore used disorder to influence measurement standards, arriving above the balcony of the bedroom with one step. Then he half-turned his body, and with a smack, he pressed one of the metal buttons on his iron-skinned pocket watch. He then solemnly said, "Teleportation is prohibited here." Silently, Mager Manor, which was being illuminated by the gigantic crimson moon, experienced an unknown change. Gairman Sparrow, whose body had rapidly turned faint after firing, appeared out of the void again. He had failed to successfully change positions. Concerto of Light and Shadow, Restriction. To Kona's Kilgore, no matter what Gairman Sparrow was good at, he had to immediately restrict his obvious ability to teleport. An enemy who could do close-quarters teleportation at a high frequency wasn't only irritating, but also dangerous. Realizing that his teleportation had failed, Gairman Sparrow's expression remained unperturbed. His body quickly warped as the colors faded from his body, leaving a deep darkness. This deep darkness suddenly collapsed across the ground, fusing with the shadows in the region where the moonlight couldn't reach, making him indistinguishable. Bang, 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 bang. Bullet holes riddled the spot where Gairman Sparrow was previously standing, tearing the ground open. Boom. The area collapsed immediately, revealing the room before. However, no dust was thrown up. And despite such a stir, Mager Manor remained blanketed in deep shadows. No one was awakened or gave a response. Kona's Kilgore suppressed the urge to restrict the action of hiding in the shadows. Holding on to Rever's shout of despair and concerto of light and shadow, he calmly observed his surroundings and waited for Gairman Sparrow to appear once again before launching his attack. However, inside the collapsed room, the shadows were silent and there wasn't any movement. And outside the window, the steeple and chimneys remained immersed in an icy cold darkness. The gigantic crimson moon seemed to be hanging over the roof. The plants in the garden, the grapevines far away, and all the various classical windows seemed to degenerate into the background on this night. Despite being visible to the naked eye, they were imperturbable. All of Mager Manor was cold, dark, and silent, just like a forgotten corner that didn't garner the attention or incur discovery from others. There were no signs of life at all. As a demigod, as an important figure in the intelligence community, Kona's Kilgore quickly had a theory. He suspected that the person was related to the authority of concealment. This gave him many ideas, but Gairman Sparrow remained nowhere to be seen. He actually didn't sneak attack and even gave up the chance to deliver a barrage of attacks, leaving me so many openings. Doesn't he know that a high-sequence lawyer or arbiter is very difficult to deal with once they're prepared prior to the battle? A sense of puzzlement flashed across Kona's Kilgore's mind. Using his observations of his surroundings and the relatively non-urgent situation, he quickly understood his current predicament. He knew that defeating Gairman Sparrow wasn't key, but escaping the concealed world was. If he couldn't leave this place, there might be more dangers awaiting him. As long as I can leave this dark-styled Mager Manor, even if angels were to descend, I don't have to worry since I'm in Backland. Such artificial concealed worlds must have an opening. This is a law that cannot be avoided in the mysterious world. The usage and distortion of laws was what lawyer pathway demigods were best at. Konas Kilgore had many ideas come to him as he quickly made a decision. He suddenly turned around and jumped from the balcony, flying off like he was a spring that was released. This demigod of the military instantly reached a high altitude, but he didn't slow down or show any signs of falling. He maintained this speed as he went higher and higher in altitude, thus achieving flight. Earl of the Fallen, exploit. This was the exploitation of laws. By extending the jumping process, he could maintain a much longer duration. If Konas Kilgore became a Sequence 2 angel, he could even jump onto the Crimson Moon with this beyonder power. While jumping in midair, Konas Kilgore swung his right arm and released his disorder beyonder power. He wanted to create a certain level of disorder in meager manner in this strange world. The true exit would then be exposed through the generated ripples. Instantly, the flowers and grapevines in the background of meager manor wavered. The black steeple, chimneys, and classical windows were covered in a faint shadow. In the entire world, only the gigantic crimson moon which appeared to be right before them didn't change. It continued hanging silently in the sky. That's the exit. Konas Kilgore grasped the patterns from the disorder, and using some actual feedback, he determined where the exit was. Without any hesitation, he exerted strength in his waist and used magnify to forcefully change his direction, allowing him to rush towards the bright red moon. At that moment, a figure appeared in front of Meager Manor. It was none other than the cold-looking Gairman Sparrow who wore a black trench coat and half-top hat. A strong gust of wind appeared out of nowhere, sweeping Gairman Sparrow upwards as he chased after Konas Kilgore. Amidst the wind, he raised the iron-black revolver in his right hand and pulled the trigger. Bang! A bullet flew out, exploding into countless fragments. They then turned into a storm that swept towards Konas Kilgore. Death note, slaughter. It was a barrage of attacks. Almost at the same time, Konas Kilgore changed direction without any warning, plummeting instead of rushing towards the moon. As a result, he dodged the bullet storm's assault as though he was prepared for it. No, it wasn't the case. He was prepared. Although his main goal was to escape the changed Meager Manor, he was still worried that Gairman Sparrow would seize the opportunity to attack him. Therefore, he came up with a simple trap, planning to use his escape as bait to fish out the hiding Gairman Sparrow. He could then take the initiative to heavily injure his opponent. Halfway down, Konas Kilgore's figure suddenly bounced back, having distorted the direction he was heading in. This time, his destination was the next point where Gairman Sparrow was flying towards. Right on the heels of that, he yanked his pocket watch-wielding left hand back and grabbed Gairman Sparrow through thin air, pulling him from a distance of nearly 100 meters away to just inches before him. Earl of the Fallen, magnify. Amidst the howling winds, Konas Kilgore grabbed Gairman Sparrow's clothes and pressed his strange revolver in his right hand forward. Bang, 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 bang. Rever's shout of despair released countless bullets like a machine gun, instantly tearing Gairman Sparrow's body into fluttering pieces of paper. Konas Kilgore's gaze froze slightly as he immediately moved his left finger and pressed one of the metal buttons on his pocket watch. With a click, this Earl of the Fallen didn't hesitate to say in a domineering fashion, "Stand-ins are prohibited here." Just as he said that, the howling wind came to a stop. Meager Manor returned to silence once again as it was blanketed by dark shadows. Konas Kilgore changed direction and began spiraling in midair in search of Gairman Sparrow. However, there weren't any anomalies in the dark night sky. This Earl of the Fallen hesitated for a moment before preparing to continue rushing towards the gigantic crimson moon. At this moment, figures appeared in the garden, vineyard, and manor's main building. They either grew or became taller, rapidly taking form. They all had black hair and brown eyes with sharp facial features. They wore silk top hats and black trench coats. They were all Gairman Sparrows. The only difference was that some of them were of normal build, some with their backs sunk inwards. The rest were bloated while others just a thin layer. Upon seeing this scene, Konas Kilgore immediately recalled a dangerous enemy he had once encountered. One of the leaders of Intis's intelligence department, a bizarro sorcerer. Chapter 10:27 to say after Konas Kilgore realized which beyonder pathway his enemy belonged to, all the Gairman sparrows in the garden, vineyard, and main building raised their left hand. They curled their middle finger, ring finger, and pinky, extending their index finger and thumb, making them take on the simple shape of a gun. The index fingers that represented barrels and muzzles aimed at Konas Kilgore in the air before their respective arms jerked up, seemingly due to the recoil. Bang, 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 bang. Amidst deafening noises, illusory doves appeared to the side of the Earl of the Fallen, who was dressed in a white shirt and black trousers. They flew at him from every direction in a spectacular sight of utmost beauty. This was the random anomaly that came about from the iron-skinned pocket watch and concerto of light and shadow. It made the air cannons which could blast through houses turn into doves of peace that didn't pose any threat. Having used disorder to disrupt the enemy's collective volley, Konas Kilgore wasn't surprised to see the doves fly up and disperse into the air. He was already mentally prepared. He had already endured the negative effects that the sealed artifact had brought for years. Taking advantage of this opportunity, he didn't hesitate to raise his hands which held the iron-skinned pocket watch and revolver, doing so in a bid to make them collide. This was distortion, one that targeted all the Gairman sparrows beneath him. To Konas Kilgore, what frustrated him the most when fighting a Bizarro sorcerer was that he was unable to tell if the enemy he faced was a marionette or the actual person unless the marionette was of a very crude level. As such, he had many beyonder powers he didn't dare use because they were ineffective against marionettes. A large-scale prohibition effect was still alright, but a single-target deprivation was meaningless in actual combat. No matter how many beyonder powers of a marionette were deprived, it didn't affect the actual body. When that happened, his opponent just needed to switch marionettes to resolve the problem. Due to similar reasons, using magnify on the mystical items on the marionettes was temporarily written off by Konas Kilgore for strategic purposes. Similarly, an Earl of the Fallen's bestowment was of no use. It was even inferior to deprivation, as it could cause a Bizarro sorcerer's marionette to lose its corresponding beyonder powers. However, the negative effects bestowed to a marionette was unable to interfere with it at all. Be it turning them sluggish, losing the will to fight, making them turn anxious, or only focus on money, it was meaningless to a marionette who was, in essence, dead, without any ability to think or inclinations to take action. Therefore, Konas Kilgore decided to first resolve the problem of identifying marionettes and the actual body. In this aspect, others might not have a solution, but a high-sequence beyonder of the lawyer pathway definitely didn't have such worries. There were rules to everything, and everything followed certain rules. As a lawyer demigod, they were good at finding whatever loopholes there were to exploit them for themselves. Together with his combat experience fighting other Bizarro sorcerers, and how he had seriously considered solutions for dealing with them during the aftermath, Konas Kilgore was quite certain that distortion could suppress his enemy. He knew that Bizarro sorcerers could seamlessly switch between their actual body and marionettes. He planned on distorting this, making the Bizarro sorcerer only be able to switch to 2 to 3 marionettes. This way, the difficulty of identifying the actual body and the marionette would be minimized. Of course, if it wasn't for the fact that distortion couldn't exceed certain limits, and area-oriented prohibition effects had reached its limit, Konas Kilgore definitely would have used a simpler method to deal with his opponent, such as forcing the Bizarro sorcerer to only be able to swap with one marionette, or he would prohibit swapping with marionettes. But Konas Kilgore smashed the Rever's shout of despair and concerto of light and shadow together as though he was compressing a large area to a small area. Earl of the Fallen, distortion. Silently, he produced a red glow with a deep shadow in his hand. It appeared as though he was offering it to the Gairman sparrows in the garden, vineyard, and main building. As for the thick and thin, normal, or terrifying crazy adventurers, none of them experienced any abnormalities. Konas Kilgore also suffered a random anomaly, one brought about by concerto of light and shadow. It had changed the distortion effects to summoning a flower from the garden below. And at that moment, the air cannons that had turned into illusory doves continued. At that moment, the battle between two demigods turned ludicrous, comical, and funny. Of course, be it Gehrman's Sparrow or Kona's Kilgore, none of them thought that was the case, especially the latter. He once again felt a familiar sense of helplessness. He didn't hesitate as he slammed his palms together again, completing the distortion. He wanted to rely on quantity to resist the random anomaly effect. However, Gehrman's Sparrow wasn't a dead person who would abide by the etiquette of turn-based combat. The large swath of crazy adventurers either raised their hands in firing stances or used a death knell with questionable authenticity, aiming at the Earl of the Fallen in midair. Meanwhile, Kona's Kilgore's heart stirred. He turned his head slightly to look up and saw that a figure had appeared once again inside the gigantic crimson moon that hung above the black steeple. The figure was wearing a silk top hat, a black trench coat, a human-skinned glove, and an iron-black revolver. He had a cold expression and a deep outline. He was another Gehrman's Sparrow. The crimson moon seemed to weigh down on his shoulders as he glided down, his body expanding and turning clearer in the process. As for the iron-black long-barreled revolver in his hand, he had already lifted it and aimed it at Kona's Kilgore. Bang! Bang! A bullet that had transparent and translucent sections to it shot out from the muzzle, heading straight for Kona's Kilgore. This was a deprivation bullet, one which was created using a worm of time that Amon's avatar had left behind. It was different from an Arbiter Pathway's deprivation. In essence, it was theft. It could steal the last 3 Beyonder powers the target had used and become empowered with the ability to use them. However, as long as the Arbiter Pathway's deprivation selected a target, then they could directly deprive them of their ability. Although this bullet's deprivation effect didn't require contact in order to be effective, the target needed to be within a certain range and unable to leave the area. In short, one was unavoidable and could only be resisted or weakened through one's level or sequence's characteristics, while the other could effectively be dodged if the shot was detected ahead of time. Klein had given up on a sneak attack and had stalled for time because, on the one hand, he wanted Kona's Kilgore to use up all his prohibition and deprivation powers on Beyonder powers that appeared important to him. On the other hand, he was also waiting for the first random anomaly to happen. Then he would seize the gap in between the two anomalies to steal Kona's Kilgore's 3 most powerful powers with the deprivation bullet. For these 2 goals, he even handed Death Knell and Creeping Hunger to Winner Enuni and made him appear like the real Gehrman's Sparrow instead of a marionette. From the current developments, Kona's Kilgore was about to lose distortion, disorder, and magnify. Bang, 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 bang. The Gehrman's Sparrows underneath collectively fired shots. Suddenly, the air cannons and the deprivation bullet exploded, turning into red, purple, yellow, or green fireworks. However, they were unable to illuminate the deep dark sky. Concerto of Light and Shadow had once again created a random anomaly. It had produced its effects several times in a row without any pauses or delays. Kona's Kilgore immediately smiled and slammed his hands together again. All of a sudden, the young men wearing silk top hats and black trench coats under the gigantic crimson moon's illumination turned gloomy. Only 2 maintained their previous states. The Earl of the Fallen's distortion had taken effect. This meant that Gehrman's Sparrow could only switch places with those 2 normal marionettes. Right on the heels of that, Kona's Kilgore didn't hesitate at all. He swung his arm and threw out the flower that was held together with the pocket watch out. The flower sped up and seemed to gain weight of unknown origins. Like an arrow, it shot towards one of the normal marionettes. This attack had been magnified and also came with the effects of bribe, weaken. Boom! The flower was like a cannon that crashed heavily into the ground, causing a violent quake. The surging waves it stirred up threw up the ordinary and unordinary humans in the vicinity, tearing or severely injuring them. The 2 marionettes which Gehrman's Sparrow could swap with had been reduced to pieces of meat. Kona's Kilgore maintained his calm. As he distorted his trajectory in midair and circled the area while in flight, he raised Rever's shout of despair and aimed it at the Gehrman's Sparrow that had descended from the crimson moon. At the same time, he silently prepared a bestowment. He wanted to give his target the negative state of lacking the will to fight. But at that moment, Kona's Kilgore's mind suddenly turned adrift as his thoughts turned sluggish. Turning into a marionette, Kona's Kilgore's mental state stiffened as he understood his current situation. He then saw that Gehrman Sparrow, who had descended from the Crimson Moon, wasn't as far away from him as before. The distance between them was only about 100 meters. He had unknowingly entered the range where spirit body threads could be controlled. He had stayed there for at least 3 seconds without realizing it. Deceit. A deceit bullet made from Amon's avatar. When Klein, who was actually Winner Enuni, had pulled the trigger, he hadn't only fired a deprivation bullet, but had actually fired twice. This was to prevent any random anomalies from happening. With an anomaly having happened once, even if another anomaly were to happen, only one of the 2 bullets that had been fired in intervals that were slightly spaced apart would be affected. After all, it was an intermittent random anomaly. It was possible to have it happen 2 to 3 times consecutively, but 4 or 5 consecutive occurrences were rare. Therefore, by attacking numerous times, there would be at least 1 or more instances that wouldn't suffer an anomaly. Just now, the firing of the second deceit bullet had been concealed by the collective volley from the marionettes. This was also why Klein made Winner Enuni use Death Knell. It was to rely on his luck. Finally, he successfully deceived Kona's Kilgore and allowed Winner Enuni to secretly enter a safe distance of 150 meters from him and begin controlling his spirit body threads and obtained initial control. The moment this began, it meant that the Beyonder power was taking effect. Since there weren't any anomalies, it meant that there wouldn't be any more. 1028 saving himself no good. My spirit body threads have been controlled by him. Having met faceless Beyonders, marionettists, or bizarro sorcerers, and even fighting senior Beyonders and demigods, Kona's Kilgore wasn't unfamiliar with the predicament he was in. He was even rather familiar with it and knew quite a bit. Therefore, he knew very well that he had fallen into a lethal trap. The time he had left to save himself didn't exceed 15 seconds. And in these 15 seconds, his thoughts would turn more and more sluggish, and the speed at which he could come up with solutions would slow down. Towards the end, just the thought of a solution would take him several seconds. Yet his stiff and dull body would require plenty of time to actualize his thoughts. This also meant that he had about 10 seconds to save himself. Of course, he had considered the corresponding response for the last few seconds. It was to abandon his body's control and reveal his mythical creature form. Through this, he could delay the time it took to become a marionette and then use his existence to disrupt the enemy, dealing a blow to them to a certain extent. However, by doing so, even if he escaped the fate of becoming a marionette and even managed to defeat his enemy, Kona's Kilgore didn't have much confidence in continuing to live. He wasn't a demigod who could freely switch between his human form and mythical creature form. He didn't have the confidence that he could maintain his rationale in a mythical creature form. In other words, the outcome of escaping the fate of becoming a marionette by releasing his mythical creature form likely meant that the human, Kona's Kilgore, would die, while a monster of the same name would occupy his body. Because of that outcome, Kona's Kilgore wouldn't make such an attempt unless it was necessary. While his thoughts weren't too sluggish, and with how he could hear Rever's shout of despair in his ears, this demigod of the military quickly came up with his first plan to save himself. He moved his right thumb at a speed that couldn't be considered slow. Earl of the Fallen, magnify. Kona's Kilgore didn't wish to magnify a particular state of his or the attack of a particular sealed artifact. Instead, it was used to magnify Rever's shout of despair side effects. This special revolver allowed the wielder to hear the roar of despair from time to time, a rather serious blow to creatures without godhood, easily pushing them to the brink of losing control, to madness, to a mental breakdown or mind blanking. And at sequence 4, the effects of the roar was greatly mitigated once his body possessed the characteristics of a mythical creature. To Kona's Kilgore, this roar was enough to turn his mind adrift and generate irascible mood swings. It didn't have much of an effect on him, and he had already gotten used to it. And at that moment, he wanted to magnify the roar of despair, to a state where even a demigod wouldn't be able to tolerate it. He wanted to use the pain that came from this psychic piercing in his mind to escape the state of having his spirit body threads being controlled. As Magnify didn't need any obvious actions, it was quick to show its effects. Opposite him, Gehrman Sparrow, who held Death Knell and wore a half-top hat, was floating in midair with strong gusts of wind swirling around him. He didn't make it in time to stop the Earl of the Fallen from successfully using this beyonder power. But in the next second, what Kona's Kilgore met in response wasn't a terrifying roar but silence. The ordinary roar that was originally present had vanished. This was a random anomaly brought about by the concerto of light and shadow. Seriously? How unlucky. Kona's Kilgore's thoughts slowly flashed past his mind. He didn't have the luxury of time to feel disheartened as he immediately made a second attempt. He raised his right hand in an unsteady manner, aiming Rever's shout of despair at Gehrman Sparrow, who stood 150 meters from him and was about to pull the trigger. At the same moment, the strong winds that blew at his right hand suddenly disintegrated in an inward fashion, turning into scattered eddies. Earl of the Fallen, disorder. Konas had used this to withstand Gehrman Sparrow's interference. Following that, there was a series of thumping sounds. Like a machine gun, Rever's shout of despair spewed out dangerous bullets without stopping. Gehrman Sparrow's black trenchcoat-covered body jerked repeatedly, but he wasn't hit. The bullets grazed his outline and flew into the distance, shattering the windows and walls, causing one of the buildings to collapse in silence. Bang, 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 bang. The subsequent bullet storm continued their barrage, and finally, Gehrman Sparrow was struck repeatedly. Amidst splattering blood, Gehrman Sparrow kept struggling and shaking in the strong gust of winds like a paper figurine, looking as though he was about to tear apart at any moment. Bang, bang, bang. The strange revolver finally stopped its roar. And apart from his head, Gehrman Sparrow was riddled with nasty gaping holes. Typically speaking, this was definitely a state that only the dead had. However, Gehrman Sparrow continued controlling the spirit body threads as though he was unaffected. The ridiculous wounds on his body slowly but resolutely healed. This was the effect of Flower of Blood. This Gehrman Sparrow was actually Inuni. The reason why he didn't die in that storm-like attack was because he had released all his accumulated luck. It was also because Kona's Kilgore was sufficiently unlucky. And the roar of despair that the bullets brought forth was nothing to a marionette. Seeing that the violent attack failed to achieve the desired effect and that the amount of time he had left to save himself dwindled, Kona's Kilgore followed his thought-out plan and slowly relaxed his 5 left fingers without any thought. The iron-skinned pocket watch left his palm and dropped to the ground. At such a critical moment, Kona's Kilgore decisively gave up the concerto of light and shadow and made it stay far away from the battlefield so as to avoid the effects of its random anomalies. Next, he might only have 1 or 2 chances to save himself. If another anomaly were to happen, the outcome was irreversible. The sealed artifact, which was a mixture of half-order and disorder, quickly plummeted to the ground. Kona's Kilgore moved his fingers with great difficulty as he faced Gehrman Sparrow, whose wounds were quickly healing. He originally had 2 choices. One was to use the third method he had originally thought of to save himself, an action that only required a mere thought. The other was to magnify his enemy's injuries and make him die on the spot. However, when Kona's Kilgore was still able to think relatively quickly, he didn't expect Gehrman Sparrow to not die after suffering so many gunshots. Even his control over the spirit body threads wasn't affected. There was no subsequent follow-up to this plan. And at this moment his brain was already like a sluggish mush. He had no way of thinking too much. He didn't wish to waste any more time as he followed his plans. Around Gehrman Sparrow, who wore a transparent glove and iron-black revolver, the strong gusts of winds that held him up suddenly intensified and sent him flying up high. With the help of the strong winds, Gehrman Sparrow raced to the pitch-black sky under the watch of the gigantic crimson moon. Earl of the Fallen, magnify. The strong winds that helped Gehrman Sparrow fly had been magnified into a hurricane. This way, the distance between him and Kona's Kilgore would stretch beyond 150 meters. That would terminate the process of turning the latter into a marionette. Seeing his goal achieved, Konas Kilgore, who had yet to regain his freedom, had his expression turn complicated bit by bit. The hurricane rapidly expanded and swept over to him, engulfing him and throwing him high into the sky. It made it impossible for the distance between him and Gehrman Sparrow to open up. He was truly unlucky. Under the night sky, amidst the moonlight, the two figures became smaller. Soon, the hurricane returned to normal as their momentum slowly diminished. Seizing this opportunity, Konas Kilgore's nearly frozen mind had another idea. Stop. He stopped maintaining his power of flight and used gravity to plummet down like a meteor, doing so in order to rapidly open up a distance from Gehrman Sparrow. Then, he ignored Gehrman Sparrow's ability to control the wind and pursue him. He slowly pulled his left arm in front of his body like it was filled with rust. It was the action of closing a door. He wanted to use an Earl of the Fallen's distortion to create a wall-like seal in the air, putting an obstacle between Gehrman Sparrow and him so that he couldn't carry out his pursuit. At that moment, the marionettes, the Gehrman Sparrows who were still alive underneath him, raised their left arms and made the gesture of firing a gun. Bang, 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 bang. Bullets shot out, enveloping Konas Kilgore in midair. After the shockwaves dispersed, Konas Kilgore was covered with several bloody holes. Due to the pain and the jolting of his body from the first few bullets striking him, he had finally snapped out of the state of having his spirit body threads being controlled. The speed of his thoughts rapidly recovered. Following that, he disordered the subsequent volley at the critical moment and distorted his injuries, preventing himself from dying. All he suffered were serious injuries. And Gehrman Sparrow, who had many mystical items and was swooping down from above, he was obstructed by the invisible wall. He failed to catch up. With another distortion, Konas Kilgore's descent speed slowed down as he gently landed on the ground. Before he could do anything else, his body froze again as he stood stiffly on the spot. He felt that his hands and feet were resisting him and not listening to his commands. He felt that there was an unfamiliar object hiding in his body. Then he saw a figure walk out of Mager Manor's master bedroom under the gigantic crimson moon's illumination and stand on the balcony. He had black hair and brown eyes, wearing a silk top hat and a black trench coat. His facial features were pronounced, and he was another Gehrman Sparrow. This Gehrman Sparrow's right hand had the gesture of firing a gun. He then pulled back his hand and blew at it. That was Klein himself. What he shot out wasn't an air bullet but a parasite bullet delivered with an air bullet's might. It was a parasite bullet created from a worm of time that Amon's avatar had left behind. It could create a worm of time that couldn't live too long, allowing it to parasitize the target and be controlled by the user. Klein had deliberately taken out the bullet and held it in his hand, specifically to wait for this opportunity. He was waiting for Konas Kilgore to throw away Concerto of Light and Shadow and not have the ability to dodge or use distortion. The former was predictable when the Earl of the Fallen's spirit body threads reached the state of initially being control. This was because he couldn't allow the random anomalies to influence his attempts to save himself, and the latter was all about patience. Just moments ago, his patience had paid off. A chance appeared. Klein was the first to raise his hand and shoot. Without the random anomalies affecting the outcome, he had accurately shot a parasite bullet into Konas Kilgore's body. If the thing that had previously taken effect wasn't a deceit bullet but a deprivation bullet, then the strategy would be different. Briefly unable to control his body, Konas Kilgore looked at the Gehrman Sparrow on the balcony remove his top hat, press his hand to his chest, and bow slightly at him under the gigantic crimson moon. As Gehrman Sparrow's trench coat fluttered, his thoughts had turned sluggish. Chapter 1029 Ruins Number 1 No. Konas Kilgore stood on the spot as a strong feeling of despair emerged in his heart. As a military demigod who had experienced many dangers, he had a clear understanding of his current situation. He could already hear the footsteps of death approaching him. He wanted to struggle and risk it by revealing his mythical creature form, but his orders didn't do a thing with his sluggish mind. His body had been parasitized, and was no longer under his control. At that moment, Konas Kilgore wasn't even capable of shedding a tear. Under the gigantic crimson moon's illumination, 1 second after another passed. Suddenly, Konas Kilgore raised his left hand and touched his crew haircut. He had already become Klein's marionette. In fact, he still had a chance at the final moment. As the parasite effect didn't last long enough for him to become a marionette, he had those 2 or 3 seconds to reveal his mythical creature form. But the problem was that his body also had the effects of misdirection and deceit. As time passed, his thoughts turned more and more sluggish and wasn't able to grasp that short opportunity. Klein looked at his new marionette and exhaled silently. He looked up at the clear and bright red moon and said, "It's done." Amidst the gigantic crimson moon, a black dot instantly appeared and descended from the sky. It was none other than the Church of Evemite's archbishop, servant of concealment, Ariana, who wore a simple robe with tree bark as a belt. In this concealed world, this ascetic didn't use any beyonder powers to float in midair. She cast her eyes at the Earl of the Fallen beneath. She gently raised her right hand as Konas Kilgore's slightly blurry soul emerged from the military demigod's head. Klein lost his control over his marionette as a result of this. He wasn't too surprised by this because he hadn't sent a worm of spirit through the spirit body threads over. His control over the marionette was essentially still at a sequence 5 state and not at the demigod level. "Where did you go just now?" Ariana asked calmly as she looked at Konas Kilgore's soul. Konas Kilgore's expression twisted slightly before replying. "Ruins number 1. Is this a contractual promise or a psychological cue?" Klein, who watched the spirit channeling from the side, sensed something from the Earl of the Fallen's reaction. However, this didn't affect anything because they were in a concealed world, one which no one knew of or could sense. "Where is that ruin? Who did it once belong to? What is it being used for?" As an archbishop of the Evernight goddess and an angel of the corresponding pathway, Ariana shared a certain amount of authority in concealment. Therefore, she didn't start with the simplest questions but went straight to the point. She wasn't afraid of any accidents. Konas Kilgore's soul trembled slightly as he exuded a feeling as if he would automatically blow up, but ultimately, nothing happened. He hesitantly replied, "That ruin is located deep underground at the Sturlwen segment of the Tussock River. It has a setup that interferes with the powers of divination and prophecy." "Sturlwen segment? This is quite far from the mountain where Mr. A was at and where you disappeared from. From the looks of it, you were very cautious. That point-to-point teleport's effects are greater than I expected." Klein quickly conjured a picture of the terrain of Backlund's northwestern outskirts. Konas Kilgore continued replying, "That ruin used to belong to Blood Emperor Alista Tudor. I'm not sure what it's currently used for. I'm unable to enter the depths of the ruins and am only in charge of sending in people and materials acquired via various means." The name Blood Emperor Alista Tudor made Ariana fall silent. About 3 seconds later, she asked, "What materials did you acquire?" This time, Konas Kilgore didn't put up much of a resistance. He listed them down, including large amounts of mercury, iron ore, and ritual materials of different domains. Klein was unable to obtain any effective information from that because it was too well-rounded. It was possible to do anything. They really are very careful, using large amounts of sundries to hide what they're truly searching for. Even the demigod in charge of these matters isn't aware of the reason. This is very in line with the way a spectator pathway beyonder works. It was designed by the psychology alchemists? Klein nodded indiscernibly with a guess in mind. Ariana didn't seem to notice anything as she asked, "Do you have any guesses on what they're doing? If so, what?" "Yes, I suspect that they're digging up something and attempting to make sacrifices." Konas Kilgore voiced out his judgment. Ariana silently looked down at him for a while and said, "Who got you involved in the underground ruins? Who are the people who can enter the depths of the ruins?" Konas Kilgore struggled once again, but there were no anomalies. He said hesitantly, "I received His Majesty's orders. I was able to become a demigod because he provided me with the formulas, ingredients, and the opportunity. He even bestowed me with the concerto of light and shadow, allowing me to act as a Sequence 5 Beyonder even in situations where I can't hide my strength. Apart from His Majesty entering the depths of the ruins, only 2 other demigods of the royal family can enter. One of them is Prince Grove, and the other is Duchess Georgina. They both have Augustus as their last names. But the royal family doesn't only have 2 demigods. Miss Justice doesn't know much of these 2 and mentioned that they seldom participate in social events. Even their seats as House of Lords Member of Parliaments are given to their children. Yes, at the demigod level, even if they lack the Beyonder characteristics of not dying and not aging, it wouldn't be a problem living for more than 100 years. It's really not suitable for them to hold official posts and repeatedly appear in public. Klein tried hard to recall, but he failed to gather anything else. Ariana was silent for a few seconds before suddenly asking, "Have you met Corins in the underground ruins?" "Who is he?" Konas Kilgore asked in confusion. Ariana didn't answer and continued asking, "Besides them, who else have you met in the underground ruins?" Konas Kilgore maintained his sluggish state, which was characteristic of spirit channeling. People from the Demonist sect and psychology alchemists. The former was originally represented by Despair Nightingale Panatia, but was changed to Saintess of White Katarina. The latter is Vin Rambus. Did they enter the depths of the underground ruins? Ariana asked meticulously. "I don't know. I wasn't following them all the time." Konas Kilgore shook his head. "At least when I met them, they were all in the periphery." Ariana asked other questions in an attempt to draw out the general outline of the matter via other angles. However, it was obvious that George Ill's arrangements were flawless. Even a demigod like Konas Kilgore only knew about the mission that he was responsible for and could only move about in designated regions. He was unable to learn more. After some thought, Ariana flipped up her right hand and gently pressed down, pushing Konas Kilgore's soul back into his body. Klein's control over his marionette was restored. This made Klein sigh inwardly. The authority of concealment is really impressive. Even if Ma'am Ariana were to question my marionette one day, I wouldn't even know. At this moment, Ariana turned her body and spoke to the Gairman Sparrow on the balcony. A problem with George III has basically been confirmed, as well as where the underground ruins are. I will immediately meet with the archbishops of the Church of Storms and Church of Steam, convincing them to take action tonight and opening the ruins. Before I inform you, control Konas Kilgore and pretend that everything is fine before making him vanish. Are you worried that the enemy will notice a problem with Konas Kilgore while negotiating with the Church of Storms and Church of Steam, making it so that they can seal off the underground ruins or activate other emergency plans? Klein had a general understanding of the matter and nodded. No problem. Ariana, who didn't have adorned hair, didn't speak further. With a casual wave of her hand, the iron-skinned pocket watch flew over. This sealed artifact was bestowed by George III. Perhaps we might be able to find some clues from its origins. Does that mean you're taking it away? Klein replied without any objection, "I'll leave it to you." He really didn't have any complaints about that, and he even believed that it was only right. After all, half of the battle's success was due to Ariana's contribution with the concealed world and blessing him with misfortune. In the event that she didn't take the concerto of light and shadow, Klein would mention it. When it came to matters like this, he was always just. And the concerto of light and shadow was the spoils of war that he didn't want the most. This was because it was at complete odds with his combat style as a Bizarro sorcerer. The random anomalies would affect him, and the weakening effect was something worse than the enemy. If Klein's spoils of war from this matter was the pocket watch, then he had considered promoting it to the snake of fate Willosepton. Only a life school of thought demigod who relied on luck to survive could commandeer the concerto of light and shadow. And when that happens, with such a huge secret organization and a sequence one, they definitely had powerful sealed artifacts that could be used to trade for it. Upon receiving his reply, Ariana gently nodded. She then threw the iron-skinned pocket watch back at Konas Kilgore, making the Earl of the Fallen look no different from before. Her figure vanished as though it had been erased by an eraser. Even the pitch-black world with the gigantic crimson moon hanging in the sky, the steeple, and chimneys were quickly wiped away. In the blink of an eye, everything returned to normal. Klein was inside the master bedroom, and Konas Kilgore was in a guest room tens of meters away. Clenched tightly in his hand was Rever's shout of despair. Then, this brigadier general of MI9 used disorder to place the revolver back into his underarm holster and pick up the mager wine he had previously poured out and took a sip. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.